Fae Wilds Book 4, Crown and Glory, written by W.J. May, narrated by Kathleen Starr Hall. The Fae Realm was paradise, but compared to the place Gilly finds herself now, anything would be. Kidnapped from her kind, she finds herself in one of the 17 hells, face to face with a creature who's set on selling her to the highest bidder, who just happens to be one of the princes of darkness. Escape seems impossible, but that won't stop her from trying. However, the more time she spends with her captor, the more she finds herself begrudgingly liking the man, until he transforms into a 9-foot-tall monster with horns. But Gilly isn't the type of fae to let a little thing like a monster get in her way. Prologue. It was dark. It was always bloody dark here in this place that her father put her. Her mother told her it was punishment for her willfulness, her shamelessness, but she knew differently. Her father put her here to forget about her, to put her out of his mind for as long as he could, and one day she knew he'd leave her here to rot. She trudged one foot in front of the other until she reached the wall. She didn't have to touch the stone to know where the wall stood, having paced the same track for long enough to know the exact dimensions of her cell. Her steps she could count, she could measure. The length of time she'd spent in this hall, however, was not so easy to determine. Time stretched out in the hall, minutes becoming hours and hours days. She drifted, forgetting whether her eyes were open or closed. The darkness was so heavy, she sometimes couldn't tell. No matter how long she stayed down here, her eyes never adjusted. There was no light, only its absence, just the darkness. And the spiders. She could hear them now, hear their little legs scraping in quiet whispers against the cold stone walls. She imagined she could hear them constructing their webs, setting traps for the insects foolish enough to burrow through the dirt and the cracks in the stone only to end up a meal. They were the reason she kept moving, the reason her hands rhythmically worked their way up and down her arms, the reason she lifted her knees high, the reason she kicked her feet forward a little when she raised them. The constant motion kept the spiders at bay, but exhaustion was always around the corner. Her steps would slow, her head start to droop. She fought off the tiredness for as long as she could, but eventually she would have to give in. Have to find a corner and huddle in it, battling sleep until her eyes shuddered of their own accord. Then the spiders would come for her. They'd crawl all over her, probing with their legs before plunging their teeth into her soft parts. Sometimes the bites were enough to wake her, sometimes not. But the welts would rise soon after, itching and burning and stinging for days afterwards. Hopelessness washed over her when she reached the opposite wall and turned, retracing her steps yet again. The memory of the look on her father's face made her shiver. An expression of pure disappointment had hovered there for long enough for her to know what he was feeling, a rarity with her father. Then his face had returned to a neutral expression as he'd order her tossed in the hole again. This time might be the last time. The thought rose inside her, making her cold all over. He'd begun leaving her in here longer and longer, the last time until she'd been close to starvation, close enough to consider chewing on the creatures who chewed on her. Giving in to the inevitable, she stopped her pacing and sat with her back against the wall. She heard rapid skittering as the spiders made way for her, then tried to put the beasts out of her mind. The image of her father, his mask having slipped, dominated her mind. He hates me. She'd known that for a long time, had felt it deep in her bones since she'd been old enough to speak in sentences, but having such surety didn't make it easier to accept. Her parents had shunned her, providing none of the affection and compassion a child should experience. She'd barely seen 10 summers, and she could go a week or longer before either her father or her mother deigned to speak to her. When she was younger, she thought there was something wrong with her, some curse that had settled on her small shoulders and made her worthy of her parents' disdain. It wasn't until she'd reached her womanhood that she'd learned the truth. One of her father's advisors had ripped the veil of ignorance from her, exposing her to the harsh truth that had confirmed all of her fears. They'd been at an official state dinner. In those days, she'd still been allowed to haunt the margins of state events, although she'd never been given the fanfare and formal introductions that had greeted her parents' entrance. She'd been hovering near the serving tables, snatching scraps to nibble with her back against the wall, watching the goings-on of the nobles of the realm. She'd been surprised to see one of her father's closest advisers, a man who might have been affectionately called Uncle if she'd received enough affection to interact with the adults surrounding her, flirting with one of the serving girls who looked almost as young as she was. When he'd caught her watching, he'd ceased his flirtation and nodded in her direction. "No need to say anything to my lady wife," he'd say evenly, giving her a smile. "I have never spoken a word to your wife before," she'd said with a shrug. "No reason to begin now." He froze for a moment, considering her words. They might have sounded knowing, coming from another, but she'd done nothing more than state the truth, which he'd picked up on then. He'd looked down on her, a look almost like pity crossing his stern features. The adviser, a well-dressed man with an overbearing mustache and a bit of a pot-belly, had coughed to clear his throat, then leaned in with a sad shake of his head. "I've never been one to put my faith in signs and wonders," he said, his voice rough. "But your father, he's a careful man. Prophecy is a heavy thing, after all." "Prophecy?" she'd asked, a chill going through her. The adviser had blown out a heavy breath, lifting the ends of his mustache. He shook his head and took 2 steps away from her. "Never mind what I said." He made a gesture as if to wave away his words. He continued his retreat, finishing over his shoulder with an offhand, "Enjoy your dinner," then returning to the table where her father sat at the head. It wasn't until she'd asked one of the rectors at the great academy that she understood fully the issue the adviser had cracked open for her. "The prophecy in question came from a witch, one your father has had dealings with since before his ascension to the throne." She still remembered the pale winter light streaming through the windows in the rector's austere office. It had seemed almost buttery, coating the desk and her hands with a yellow glow. She'd listened as the old academic had unwound the mystery of the prophecy and confirmed the curse that had hung over her head since before her birth. The witch scryed, using her ancient crystals said to be taken from the innermost core of the realm, and returned with the prophecy that your father's rule would be destroyed by his first and only offspring, who would weave her own destiny beyond the realm. He looked at the ceiling, his features drooping. Her exact words were, "The fruit of the poison tree will wither the line." Her heart had leapt into her throat, and she'd had trouble breathing. No wonder my father hates me. He believes I will be the one to destroy him. She'd noticed the rector's hands then, had seen the fingers shaking. She'd looked up, surprised at the fleeting flash of fear she'd seen on his features. "There's something he hasn't told me. How did my father respond to the prophecy?" She grew the courage to ask, her voice sounding creaky to her own ears. The rector looked at her, pausing before answering. "I think you know the answer to that in the treatment you have received. As heir, you should be feted, celebrated by those in the palace and outside it, but you're almost universally reviled." She flinched at his answer, realizing in that moment that his words were true. She'd expected things to change when she reached her majority, expected the realm to accept her as its next ruler, but her 12th name day had come and gone, and she'd been given next to no education about the realm and her place in it. They never intended for me to rule. Is there any way this prophecy won't come to pass? She'd known the answer before the rector opened his mouth, but she'd needed to hear it from another's mouth. Your father asked the same question of the witch. Her answer was more cryptic than the prophecy itself. Bites pump venom into a heart wounded by hate, a cleansing by pollution. He'd shaken his head, then pulled open a heavy tome that sat on the corner of his desk. Many scholars have puzzled over those lines. but the most accepted definition is by the Chancellor of the Great Academy. She knew the Chancellor, a bloated bald man whose dark eyes had made her feel nauseous whenever they followed her. The words the rector read from his book did not surprise her. The most important word from the witch's response is cleansing. The pollution she mentions pertains to the hate in the line before. Only hatred can cleanse that venomous pollution, hatred against the one to whom the prophecy pertains. The slam of the shutting tome made her jump. He means me. Hatred toward me. The rector had nodded, his expression sheepish. Learned opinion skews toward shunning you. Why not just kill me? She'd asked, her voice rising in frustration. That would have been easier for everyone. You are still your father's heir, the queen having failed to bear him other offspring. The murder of a member of the royal bloodline is punishable by death, even at the king's direction. Those laws were set in stone centuries ago, and there is no appetite to change them. So my father can't love me, and he can't kill me. Instead, he chooses to lock me away, to make sure I feel the hatred he feels for me, hatred that is supposed to cleanse somehow. She pondered the exchange again as she sat in the dark, wondering how all of this would end. The prophecy said she would wither the line. Perhaps my father hopes to wither me first, to keep me from the sun in this dank hole, until I am too weak to destroy anything. She felt it then, the first bite. It burned, and for a second she thought she could feel the burning burrowing inward, along the veins in her leg until it reached the biggest vein and catapulted toward her heart. Blinking with sudden understanding, a smile crept across her face for the first time in the hole. She moved her hands to her leg, gently cupping them to collect the spider that had buried its fangs in her. She moved it to her face where she spoke softly to it. Bite me, she said, grinning, and tell your friends to do the same. Wonder filled her as she felt one of the spider's legs touch her cheek, as if it understood what she said. Moments later, she felt another bite, then another. The spiders around her swarmed, crawling over every inch of exposed skin, sinking their fangs deep. Spider venom flooded her, barreling toward her wounded heart. She could feel something changing inside her. The shreds of youth and innocence that still clung to her were ripped away. The fear that had made her avoid the crawling creatures gone. She leaned her head against the wall and sighed, the pain of the bites turning to pleasure. I might be fruit from the poison tree, but I won't be the only one rotting in the dark. Not for long. Chapter 1. It took her a moment to realize the groaning she heard was coming from her. Gilly opened her eyes, breaking at last out of the same dream that had trapped her every night since her abduction. She attempted to stretch, but the bindings held her fast, and she soon gave up, fighting back tears that had once felt unfamiliar. They made their way down dirty cheeks, and since her hands were bound above her head, tied to a stake plunged into the dirt floor, she could not wipe them away. Using all of her strength, she wrenched at the bindings, as she did multiple times a day, but they did not budge. They were made of strands of grass woven together, and Gilly should have been able to break through them easily, but they were stronger than silver. They must be imbued with magic, she thought, not for the first time. The same magic that won't allow me to call on my own powers. By now she knew for certain that Willow was not the youthful wildling she'd pretended to be for the last decade or so. Gilly had never fully trusted the woman purely on instinct, as there was little the woman had done, save complain. That would have earned that distrust. She'd wandered into a wildling camp years ago, claiming to have hailed from one of the villages that had been razed and salted, never to be fertile again. Gilly had once believed the city dwellers were at fault for the destruction, until she'd learned of the Eater of Worlds and the sorcerer's attempts to devour the Fae Realm and its creator's powers. It was apparent now that Willow was not a wildling at all, but something else. A non-Fae who had impersonated the appearance of one of the fair folk to infiltrate the society, lying in wait for the Eater of Worlds to slip up and be defeated. In the chaos after the sorcerer's defeat, Gilly had been distracted by the dark-haired woman's demeanor. Confusion and hope had been the emotions on display by the majority of Fae after the revelation of the Fae Queen, who had put aside her crone appearance to reclaim her true one. Willa, however, had been plundering the stash of weapons and potions the Winking Hand had brought along in case of trouble. Gilly had encountered her in the magic user's tent, a potion of control in her hand. She'd looked up when Gilly confronted her, reminding her of the rule that only magic users were allowed to access the Winking Hand's supplies. Willa had groaned, her temper showing, and suddenly she'd lashed out with the unseen braided grass rope she'd been holding in her other hand. Gilly was fast, but that day, Willa had been faster, managing to wrap the binding around one of Gilly's wrists. The rope had acted on its own accord then, expertly wrapping itself around Gilly until she'd been pulled to the ground, wrists bound to ankles behind her back. "What in the 17 hells?" Willa had shaken her head, then knelt beside her, pouring the potion into her mouth. Gilly had tried to spit it out, but Willa put a hand over her lips and held her nose, forcing her to swallow enough of it for Gilly to feel its effects. "It's about time I shut that haughty mouth of yours, girl," Willa hissed. "My powers once far outweighed yours, before Rashon managed to steal them from me through trickery and my own vulnerability, a vulnerability I no longer suffer from. You're my ticket to getting everything back." The woman's laugh had caused shivers to run down Gilly's spine. She wanted to deny what Willa was saying, but the potion made it so that she could not speak without a command to do so. Willa put a finger on Gilly's nose, a hateful grin on her face. "No longer will I have to limp along with the meager remnants of magic I managed to retain. Not enough to be detected by your Winking Hand, but enough to help me get out of scraps from time to time. Once I complete the ritual, I'll have every ounce of that gorgeous Fae power that resides inside of you." Anger rose inside her as she replayed the scene of her abduction in her head for the 100th time. Gilly struggled harder against her bonds, but they moved not an inch. When she'd exhausted her strength, she sat, breathing heavy, muscles aching. Sweat started to pool where her limbs were bent, the heat of the day rising already. Sunlight was making its way through the uneven wooden slats that made up the small shack where she was being held. Heat like this made her know that they were no longer in the Fae Realm. Wherever they were in the web, Gilly had no idea. It was her first time leaving the Fae Realm, and she'd had no idea what lurked outside the walls of her wooden prison. She moved her hand until it came across the small, sharp rock she'd found while flailing around the first night of her imprisonment. Picking it up, she used it to scratch another notch in the wall near her head. According to her rudimentary accounting, she'd been tied up there for 5 days. Her mouth was dry, her stomach hollow. Although Fae were deceptively hardy creatures, given their delicate appearance, she knew she couldn't exist forever without some sort of sustenance. But the traitor Willa had yet to return since she dumped Gilly off and retied the indestructible grass rope. There was nothing she could do but lie there and wait, either for Willa to return or to slowly and painfully starve to death. She didn't know how many hours passed before the door swung open suddenly, revealing a woman she knew was Willa, even though the woman no longer affected the Fae wildling appearance. Her body was almost as delicate as a Fae's, but she lacked the telltale ears and glowing skin. Her dark hair shone around her shoulders, her coppery skin kissed by the sun. She was wearing a nondescript black outfit, tight-fitting stockings, and a long-sleeved top that clung to her like a second skin, a jacket that went to her thighs and looked like it was molded to her, completing the look. She crouched down, giving Gilly a once-over. "Good, you're still alive. I wasn't sure if your Fae species had the characteristic durability of your kind." Gilly's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about? And where are we?" Willa ignored her, instead choosing to complain about how long it had taken to secure transport.
You'd think demons were out of fashion nowadays, and not one witch at the exchange. Can you believe it?"
Gilly had no idea what she was blathering about. She scowled at her prisoner, but it had no effect.
"The web isn't what it used to be, you know, before I spent millennia trapped in the Fae Realm," Willa continued. "But I finally managed to find a way off-world."
"Release me," Gilly said, ignoring the woman's words, "or face the wrath of the Fae Queen and her king and their combined armies."
Yes, quite threatening," Willa said, then bent to the bindings near Gilly's feet. "If I had my powers, I could wink between worlds with less effort than a burp after a good meal. Instead, I've got to trust some teleporter to take me where I need to go, not to mention wasting valuable time and effort in securing that transport."
"I could give a leaf about your transportation issues," Gilly growled. She realized suddenly that her feet were free and aimed a kick at her captor, seeing her first chance at escape since she'd been taken.
"Naughty girl,"
Willa said, nimbly dodging her leg and moving out of its way. Gilly scrambled to use her legs as leverage to free herself, so she missed Willa digging something out of her bag. The woman knelt beside her head and quickly fastened that something around Gilly's neck. The strength went out of her, suddenly sapped by the collar that now sat against her skin, causing it to itch ferociously. Willa patted her cheek, giving her a wink. Then the woman's tone turned serious.
"That pink powder got us this far, but now we've got to rely on others to take us further. You're going to behave. Whether you like it or not, that collar will make sure of it."
"Iron." The word raced through her brain, setting it on fire. "You put me in iron?" Gilly couldn't believe it. Fae were naturally allergic to the substance, which was why it had been banned in their realm. With the collar around her neck, her strength was a fraction of what it was before, and her magical abilities would be impossible to access. Willa untied the rope from the stake above Gilly's head, then tugged on it, forcing her to rise. Gilly's legs were unsteady, her muscles crying out from movement after such a long time of stillness. She wanted to leap on the woman, to tear her to pieces, but all she could do was pant as Willa pulled her hands behind her neck and wrapped the bindings around them, leaving a long enough length of rope to act as a leash of sorts.
"We've got some miles to go,"
Willa told her as she led her out into the blistering sunshine.
"You're going to do as you're told, or I might decide your powers aren't worth the trouble after all and give your blood to the dry ground."
Gilly staggered out of the shack, taking in her surroundings for the first time since their arrival in whatever realm they were currently occupying. It was a dusty world, but there were a few gnarled trees growing in a stand of grass before her, not far from what looked like a dwelling of some sort. Not unlike the houses the stone lovers build, she thought to herself. Waves of heat made the horizon look unfinished, not the defined line she was used to. Willa pushed her forward, forcing her to put one foot in front of the other as they made their way to a road that was little more than a dry brown tract of dirt. There were no other people around her. Gilly wasn't sure whether to be disappointed or relieved. If she had seen a person, would she have called for help? The question became real when they came over a hill to see a wagon coming in their direction. It was pulled by a creature Gilly had never seen before, with long curved horns and shaggy hair of dark purple. It had 6 legs, a wide snout, and a pair of shining dark eyes. Riding on the wagon itself was a large male, his skin tinted green, 2 small tusks peeking out above his bottom lip. It was a type of creature she'd not seen before, one that looked vaguely menacing and also slightly pedestrian, as it was doing something so prosaic. I should call out to him, see if he can help. Gilly opened her mouth, then closed it again when she felt something sharp poking into her back.
"I asked you to behave, remember?"
Willa whispered, moving closer to her. The wagon rattled past without another glance from its driver, and Gilly felt the optimism go out of her like smoke disappearing into the night.
"Good girl,"
Willa said, removing the sharpness that could only be a blade's point from Gilly's back.
"That half-orc wouldn't have been much help anyways,"
she said conversationally.
They aren't very bright, and half of his type would eat you as soon as talk to you.
Gilly wasn't sure if she trusted her kidnapper's words, but it didn't matter now. Only one question was hovering in her mind, a question on which all of her hopes would hinge. "Where are you taking me?" Willa looked over at her, grinning.
"We're going to the one place in the web where anyone can find anything they need. It's where I found that elaborate piece of jewelry I gifted you with," she said, motioning toward the collar, "and a few other odds and ends to keep me going. It's also where we're going to meet a certain demon and hitch a ride."
Gilly frowned, not liking the thought of seeking out a demon. Still, it's better than being tied up in a shack for days on end. Her stomach rumbled. And maybe I'll get a chance at a meal. Bone tired, she forced herself to keep walking, hoping that their destination would provide her with an opportunity to turn the tables on the woman at her side. Chapter 2. Gilly figured it was 2 hours later when Willa pointed something out in the distance. "Our destination?" she said, and Gilly blinked tired eyes at the hazy metropolis ahead of them.
"Once we reach the limits of the exchange, you're going to have to stick tight to me."
"The exchange?" Gilly asked, not having heard it before.
"It's a way station of sorts, a place to exchange goods and services that is virtually unregulated," Willa explained. "We're in a pocket dimension whose location in the web moves periodically, and only those who have been there before can find it again. It helps keep out unwanted prying eyes. We were lucky to reach it with the pink powder, but now we need to hitch a ride elsewhere."
"Why bother to come here if we were just planning to go somewhere else?" Her choice didn't make sense to Gilly.
"I didn't exactly have a lot of time to plan my exit from the Fae Realm," Willa answered with a heavy dose of snark. "There is equipment I will need for the ritual that I can't just pick up at any old market."
"So that's what you've been doing all week? Gathering supplies?"
"Something like that," Willa grumbled. "The collar you're wearing didn't come cheap, so I had to barter with what I had and work my way up to it."
They were nearing the border of the city when Willa stopped them again. She stood behind Gilly's back, working at the bindings that still held her hands in place.
"We will draw too many eyes if I keep you in bondage, and right now we need to not attract notice. If you think you're going to try something, do it now before we get into the thick of the crowds and you draw attention to us."
As soon as the ropes fell away, Gilly lunged forward. Scanning her surroundings, she knew the iron around her neck would keep her from running fast enough to avoid being caught. But maybe. Without thinking, she reached for her powers, aiming a binding spell at her companion. The magic fizzled the moment she cast it, no doubt due to the collar. Knowing she had no other choice, she sprinted forward away from Willa as fast as her feet would carry her, which, it turned out, wasn't very fast due to the exhausting effects of the iron. Her fingers scrambled at the collar around her neck, desperately trying to unfasten it, but she could find no hinge or lock, no way to unclasp the thing. A moment later, currents of air wrapped around her, freezing her in place. Willa moved in front of her, shaking her head.
"Have you gotten it out of your system yet?"
"I thought you had no magical powers," Gilly spat angrily.
"It was a busy week for me," Willa said with a giggle. "I managed to corner a sorcerer, a young one, and use the same trick Rashawn used on me to drain him of his burgeoning powers. It isn't much, especially compared to yours, but it's enough to keep you in line while you've got the collar on. So no more funny business, or you'll find yourself in more trouble than you can handle."
Gilly realized she'd had no choice but to follow the woman who'd imprisoned her into the city. Already on edge, she was disturbed by what she saw around her once they passed through the gates. Creatures of every size, shape, and color were around her, passing through the streets and entering buildings that looked more like dens or hovels than proper shops and restaurants. It was nothing like the cities she'd visited in her own realm. Especially that smell, she thought, her nose wrinkling at the stink that seemed to pervade the streets and alleyways of the exchange. Why anyone would choose to come here, she thought, then stopped as she saw a group of beings roped together with heavy chains being led by a creature that looked like the male in the wagon's nasty older cousin. Maybe they all don't choose, she thought wryly, shifting to give the creature with the tusks and green skin a wide berth. They turned a corner, Gilly struggling to keep pace with Willa's fast footsteps. They passed a ragged tent that had seen better days, its red having faded under the heavy sun. Its flap rusted in the wind, revealing a dim interior where dark creatures with golden eyes crouched in groups of 2s and 3s. One made eye contact with Gilly, and a chill gripped her throat. She looked away, swallowing hard. Those weren't the only disturbing creatures she came across. Although sunlight burned overhead, creatures of the night clung to overhangs and paste-covered walkways. Creatures with fangs on the lookout for fresh blood, she imagined, noting the pale skin and bright blue eyes that indicated a vampire was lurking. They'd had a few vampires in the Fae Realm, she'd heard, until they discovered the leech's true nature and banned the species from visiting. 1 or 2 might slip in via magical means, but the crone was always quick to dispatch them when she felt their presence. Gilly wished the crone were here now, so they could take revenge on the woman who'd abducted her and was planning to steal her birthright as daughter of the Fae Queen. Wishes are as useful as an iron collar, at least to me, she thought with a frown, then rubbed her weary face. The vampires were joined by were creatures of several varieties, Gilly spotting bear shifters, werewolves, and even a rare dragon shifter as they walked. Unlike most Fae, she had knowledge of many off-world races thanks to the crone's library. She'd once found an encyclopedia of creatures and had spent a summer memorizing it, poring over pages that listed everything from chimeras to cyclops, gorgons to golems, minotaurs to manticores. "You look familiar." Gilly turned to the deep voice, seeing that it was directed at her companion. It came from a mouth belonging to a more than 8-foot-tall male with rippling muscles, the limp remnants of a once massive lion's pelt wrapped around his body in just enough places to keep him from being entirely naked. Willa looked up, and Gilly could see the anxiety on her face.
"I'm afraid you have me confused with someone else."
She hurried her steps, locking her arm with Gilly's to force her to move faster. The giant, however, had no problem keeping pace. "I do know you. You're Arachne, the Great Weaver." The giant ran, a hand through his unruly red hair, and tried for a charming expression. "It was a shame what Minerva tried to do to you." Willa sighed and brought them to a stop.
"Yes, Carcass, I recognize you." Waving a hand in front of her face, she grimaced. "And I see you still have horrible breath, even after all these eons." The giant's face mottled, and Gilly saw smoke course out of his nostrils. He leaned in with narrowed eyes. "You used to be much nicer." "And you used to be a snazzy dresser, but that pelt has seen better days. Might be time to retire it."
Willa had no fear in cutting the giant down, making Gilly wonder where her confidence was coming from. She started studying her surroundings in case things went south. The giant's hand reached down for Willa, and Gilly saw her opportunity. Without hesitation, she leapt sideways, as much as her weakened state would allow, and rolled to the ground, coming to rest under a roadside cart belonging to a knife sharpener. She didn't stop to watch Willa's reaction, instead crawling out from the other side of the cart and sprinting toward a nearby alleyway. She'd made it halfway down when she froze, letting out a groan of pain. It was as if there were an invisible wall in front of her, and she'd just run headlong into it. She turned around, trying to shake it off, when she noticed the giant holding up his hand in front of his face, confused by the sight of a dagger sticking out of it. Willa shrugged at him, then pulled out another dagger, moving forward to slice at his ankles. Gilly turned away from the fight, heading in an alternate direction, hoping to avoid the wall she couldn't see. She made it 2 steps before slamming into another one. It knocked her back, making her stumble and fall on her behind. Gilly sat in the dirt of the street, watching as the giant let out a groan. "That's it!" he roared in anger, then took a heaving breath and blew outward, expelling a spurt of hot flame in Willa's direction. The petite woman met flames with ice, a cold blast radiating from her fingertips and putting the giant's breath of flames out instantly. Gilly realized the woman was more powerful than she'd expected, even with minimal magic. She scrambled to her feet, feeling her way along the wall, looking for a gap that she could fit through. By the time she'd realized that she was entirely boxed in, the ground began to shake. The giant's footsteps caused miniature earthquakes as he fled, looking over his shoulder in fright. Willa dusted off her hands, then came to retrieve Gilly, her hand passing through the invisible wall with ease to grab her prisoner by the arm.
"I can't fault you for trying when an opportunity like that presents itself," she grumbled. "But I hope you see now that trying to escape is useless."
"Why did you talk to him like that?" Gilly asked while Willa led them back in the correct direction. "He was nice to you."
Willa scoffed. "His type is never nice, even when they're pretending to be. They only respect strength, which is what you have to show them. Otherwise, you'll end up pushing a boulder up a hill forever or some such nonsense."
Gilly had no idea what that meant, and Willa wasn't inclined to explain.
"There it is,"
she said with a grin, giving her a shove in the direction of a squat stone building covered in dead vines.
"I should have known it from the stink alone."
Above the building hung a wooden sign in the shape of a cage. The painted bars held in little golden shapes with wings, and burned into the wood above the cage was the name Sprite's Landing.
"Come on,"
Willa said, pushing her through the door. Gilly's hand moved to cover her nose and mouth as the smell of rotten body odor mingled within the dank confines of the tavern. It was dim and crowded, the square bar seating a motley collection of creatures. She heard a growl and turned around to see a tall, slender male in black robes pull back on a leash of a three-headed dog who was foaming at the mouth. "Get that mutt out of here if you can't calm him down," called the bartender. He was bright blue in color and had 8 arms, each of which was busy mixing a drink. Gilly shook her head, her senses overloaded by the menagerie around her.
"There he is,"
Willa said cheerfully, waving her arm at someone out of sight. Gilly was annoyed by the woman's incessant positivity, especially in the face of what they were seeing. And smelling, she thought with a grimace. Willa yanked her in the direction of a line of booths that ran against the far wall. In the final booth sat a dark-haired male with his back turned to them. Her companion didn't hesitate to shove Gilly into the booth with the stranger, sliding in beside her and greeting the man pleasantly. "Took you long enough," he growled, and Gilly caught a faint whiff of sulphur above the rest of the stench. She looked the man over, taking in tanned skin, except where it was hidden by the fabric of his shirt and thigh-hugging pants. She was surprised to note attractive features and... Are those horns? It's the demon. She had been serious about that. Gilly balled her hands into fists, her nails digging into her palms. Demons were not unknown among the Fae, but they were creatures that were avoided on instinct. There was something about them that chilled Fae to the core, and it was no different now sitting across from one. Although she considered herself brave, Gilly couldn't stop the shiver that crept over her skin. The demon's gaze moved to her, then froze. "What do we have here?" Chapter 3.
"Her?"
Willa asked with an unamused look on her face.
"She's nobody. Let's talk about this deal we're making."
Gilly kept an eye on the proceedings, splitting her focus to also keep attentive to the menacing beings that were all around them. Her hand had also snuck to her collar, hoping that while Willa was distracted she could get it open somehow. "She's an elf," the demon said instead, looking her over in a way that made Gilly feel slightly sick. "What's an elf doing here?"
"I said she was nobody, so don't worry about it," Willa replied with steel in her tone. "Are you still willing to transport us?"
"Elves avoid sorceresses," he said, ignoring her words. "She would never choose to associate with you." "You got that right," Gilly said out of the side of her mouth, earning a scowl from Willa, who slapped away her hand from her collar. The demon cocked an eyebrow at her, the hint of a smile on his face.
"She's not an elf," Willa said dismissively. But I'm in a hurry, so if you please.
Not an elf. She's got pointed ears. Crossing his arms, the demon leaned back, as if he was set for a long discussion of Gilly's origins.
Lots of races have pointy ears, Willa countered.
True, the demon replied. Then which race of pointy ear is she? Head tilted, he stared at Gilly. There are many different races to choose from. He lifted his hand and extended his fingers, counting them off. Goblins, merfolk, halflings.
I can't believe I'm being lectured on biology by a demon, Willa said, rolling her eyes. She's not an elf. She's Fae.
The demon froze, then let out a loud belly laugh, making some of the beings in the booths around them swivel their heads to look. She's no Fae. She doesn't have wings.
Not all Fae have wings. She's from the ones that don't.
Willa shot back with another eye roll.
Just like not all demons have brains, apparently. Can we get back to this deal or what?
Her impatience was palpable, but the demon wasn't moved, making it clear that he was in control of the power dynamic currently. There are no Fae that don't have wings, he said, his tone matter-of-fact. Willa threw her hands toward the heavens.
Gilly, why don't you shake out your wings and prove to this fool that you're a Fae?
But you just told him some Fae don't have. She stopped speaking when a pair of golden lacy wings appeared on her back. Wings. Gilly realized the wings on her back had no weight, and she had no control over them. Willa must be projecting them with her magic.
There, are you happy? Willa said, waving a hand in her direction. Can we get on with it?
The demon looked skeptical, but he finally turned his attention to Willa. I believe we settled on 3 pounds of diamonds.
Willa let out a strangled sound. It was £1, and that's a fortune for the service you're offering.
My services work on a sliding scale basis, he replied pointedly. The more desperate the buyer, the higher their fee. Willa's mouth slammed shut, and Gilly noticed that her eye was twitching. The normally calm and collected woman was noticeably anxious, which had Gilly's senses on alert. If she's worried, I should be terrified.
£1, Willa growled again. You won't find better cut, clarity, or quality.
£2, he countered, a wicked smile on his face. Gilly noticed that his canine teeth were pointed, raising the goose flesh already on her skin up another notch.
Ridiculous,
Willa said, standing, hands on her hips. She began to lecture him on economics, negotiation tactics, and finally something called seller's remorse, which she was promising would hit him immediately if he didn't lower his prices. A crackle of energy passed over her fingertips in a wordless threat. The demon pressed his lips together, thinking over her offer. £1.50, he said after a moment. You want to go to Eden, right? At her nod, he crossed his arms. My kind are not welcome there, a fact which you well know. That means I'm risking more than usual to take you where you want to go. His gaze flickered over to Gilly. Then there's your traveling companion, which you did not inform me about in advance, unless you plan to leave her behind.
She comes with me,
Willa replied through gritted teeth. 2 of you should double the price, don't you think?
I do not think,
Willa said, her tone hot as the confines of the shack where Gilly had been imprisoned.
I think £1 is exactly enough, considering it will take less than 5 minutes of your time, and I'm already offering you a fortune.
Then maybe you'd consider a trade. Give me this one and a pound of diamonds, and I'll take you to Eden.
This one is non-negotiable,
Willa said, retaking a seat and putting an arm around Gilly. Gilly considered shaking it off, but figured it wouldn't help anything if she did. I'm thinking a place called Eden is probably preferable to the exchange, which stinks like its diaper needs to be exchanged. Give me the girl, he replied in a deeper voice, twin curls of smoke making their way out of his nostrils. No diamonds, just her. Willa's fingertips were crackling with energy again.
£1 only, and we leave now. The girl is coming with me."
The demon's eyes flashed red, sending a ripple of fear through Gilly. At that moment, 3 figures approached, interrupting the negotiations. "Long has it been since I have seen ladies of your quality in such dismal surroundings." This came from a handsome male with pale skin and ice-blonde hair that fell halfway down his back. He took Willa's hand and leaned over in a formal fashion, pressing his lips against it. When he straightened and smiled, Gilly realized he had pointed teeth. Vampire. His companions were no less frightening. A hirsute male with a bulging chest and a ruddy complexion nodded in Gilly's direction. He was a shifter, a wolf by the looks of him, which made sense since he was traveling with a leech. The other one had her stomach churning, and she was relieved she hadn't been fed in days, as that meant there was nothing in her belly to vomit up. Its gray skin and pervasive smell of decay informed her that she was looking at a member of the Walking Dead. A vamp, a werewolf, and a zombie all walk into a bar. Gilly bit the inside of her cheek to resist the urge to laugh loudly, even in the absence of a punchline.
"Excuse me, gentlemen," Willa replied with all the simper she could muster, "but we're in the middle of important business dealings."
"We did not mean to interrupt," the leech said with a wink that made Gilly want to gag. "We only hoped to buy you a drink." The word drink had Gilly's mouth filling with saliva, even if her rational mind was advising her not to touch a drop of whatever came out of the rank tavern. Her eyes flashed to Willa, the hope in them apparent.
"Fine,"
Willa said, heaving a sigh.
"Buy a round for the table."
"This was a deal between the 3 of us," the demon growled, upset at the interruption. Willa gave him an angry glare, then motioned to the vampire to proceed.
"Don't be rude."
The vamp summoned a waitress to his side. She looked like she'd seen better days, her skin sallow and her hair limp. Gilly noticed she was wearing an iron ring around her shapely leg, and wondered if she too were being forced to obey by the metal that was a scourge to many creatures who made their home in the web. The waitress disappeared, only to return shortly with a tray full of drinks. They were bright green and bubbling, but that didn't stop Gilly from wanting to drain each glass before anyone else could. She restrained herself while the drinks were passed around, reaching for one from the waitress's hand. Willa intercepted her, taking the drink and her own and placing them in front of her.
"What should we toast to, boys?"
Willa asked with a saucy smile. Gilly kept her head down, plotting on a way to retrieve the glass from the woman's hand. She was so thirsty. She thought she might begin to drool in a moment. The zombie raised his glass high. "To 2 beautiful ladies," he said, his mouldering lip and decaying voice box having issues. The shifter and leech repeated his toast, raising their own glasses. Willa nodded, lifting a glass while keeping her hand over the other one.
"To new friends."
Gilly saw her eyes flick to the demon, who was scowling back at her. His glass left the table. She then put the glass to her lips, preparing to drink. The 3 interlopers followed her action, knocking back the bubbling brew in a single gulp. A second later, they fell as one into a heap on the dirty tavern floor. Willa put her glass down, the level just as high as before. Gilly realized, knowing now, that the sorceress had faked her sip. Whoever drank, dropped. Willa was a woman on a mission, and no one, even gentlemen admirers, would pull her off course. She looked at the glasses and knew she couldn't drink them. Her thirst would continue unabated. What was the point of that? She grumbled to herself.
"I think this demon might learn by example," Willa replied to the rhetorical question. "And now he has an example of what happens when people annoy me."
The demon shoved the glass away from him and stood, letting out another stream of smoke from his nose. £1 it is, but I want to see them now." Willa pulled a pouch from her jacket and opened it for the demon to peruse. He reached inside and pulled out a gem, watching it flash in the light. "Good quality," he admitted gruffly.
We've wasted enough time. Let's get moving.
Willa's impatience was obvious. At his nod, she snatched back the jewel and tossed it back into the pouch, tucking it away inside her jacket once more. She stepped out of the booth and pulled Gilly with her. Tiredness aside, Gilly was relieved they were leaving. The stench of the tavern, coupled with the unconscious undead rotting beside their booth, was almost more than she could stand. "Out the back," the demon said, hucking his thumb over his shoulder. Willa and Gilly followed, out through a large door onto a small stone landing which stood beside a slow-moving river of sludge. "It stinks just as badly outside," Gilly groaned, covering her mouth with her hand and gagging. "You won't have to smell it for long," the demon growled. He held out his hands to them. "Take one and hold on tight. I won't be responsible for anyone getting lost in the nether while we're traveling."
The nether?
Gilly had never heard the word before.
The space between worlds,
Willa said, grabbing the demon's hand and motioning for her to do the same.
Hold on, like he says.
Gilly held out a trembling hand and the demon grabbed it. A moment later, she was hurtling through a void of spinning colors, air rushing past her ears with a deafening whoosh. Just as suddenly, she felt her momentum arrest, a blinding light forcing her to close her eyes. Then they were shooting off again. What little bile was left inside her, working its way up her stomach and threatening to escape. Before it could, she felt her knees hit the ground as they stopped once again. "What was that?" she croaked, then felt herself lean forward and crash into the sand beneath her. She felt weak, her thoughts spinning as if being sucked into a whirlpool. Gilly managed to turn herself off and gasped up at the light of two suns blazing above her. "Where are we?" When no one answered her, Gilly turned her head to find the demon looking down at her with an expression of unbridled amusement. Where is Willa?" The demon let out a deep chuckle and shrugged his shoulders, and ice filled Gilly's veins. Chapter 4. The demon finally helped her to her feet, and Gilly rocked on her heels for a moment, feeling like she was still spinning. "Answer me," she said at last, her voice stronger this time. "Where are we? Where's Willa?" "If you're asking about the sorceress, she's gone." He tossed the pouch that rested in his palm up just to feel it fall back into his hands, heavy with diamonds. "I never intended to take her to Eden anyway." Pulling the pouch open, the demon plucked out a large diamond and held it up to the suns. He smiled widely, clearly delighted with himself. Then the diamond began to melt, and soon there was nothing left, not even his smile. "Looks like she never intended to make good on her part of the bargain either," Gilly pointed out. "Stone-hearted sorceresses," he said, like a curse. "I knew better than to trust her." He tossed the pouch to the ground and focused his gaze on Gilly. "Good thing I decided to grab you too. I'd planned to dump her off on some random realm after relieving her of her belongings, but all she had was you, it turned out. So, here we are." "And Willa is where exactly?" "Does it matter?" he replied. "I can see the iron around your neck. I'll bet she's the one who put it there. You're just exchanging owners as I see it." "No one owns me," Gilly growled, her spine straightening. "I'm a Sigilla of the Wildling Fae, apprenticing to the crone and daughter of Elspeth, the Fae Queen." "And that is why you will fetch your weight in diamonds," he said, with a healthy dose of enthusiasm. "Especially with that little trick you can do with your wings. Where did they go now?" Gilly looked over her shoulders, then chided herself for the motion. "I don't have wings," she groaned out. "The sorceress put them on me just to shut you up. And for your information, some Fae don't have wings." His smile faltered. "I'm sure the gents at the auction tend to have seen your like before. It won't take them long to convince you to show them again, little fairy." The demon turned, pointing in the direction of a stand of palm trees. "Over there! Move, now!" Gilly's limbs felt heavy as she trudged in the sand toward the palms. Fae were light and muscular creatures, and she was used to running along branches and leaping tree to tree. She should be able to make short work of the sand, but With the iron and near starvation, Gilly could barely make herself move. Her legs were unsteady in the shifting sands, and she wasted no time voicing her complaints. "Why didn't you just teleport us into the auction?" she griped. "I don't see the point of being able to travel like that if you still have to walk so far once you arrive." She had had her first experience with teleportation and wasn't eager to repeat it. "You already did repeat it," her brain reminded her. "Willa used the pink stuff to bring you to the exchange, so technically you've realm hopped twice now." "That's twice too many," she grumbled under her breath. "You have a big mouth for such a little thing," the demon grumbled. "I'm sure I can find a gag for you if you've got more vitriol to spew." Gilly would normally have worked herself into a towering rage, using her tongue to slice the demon to bits, but she couldn't work up the energy at the moment. "It's not worth it," she said to herself, her breath heaving. It wasn't until they reached the shade of the palm trees that Gilly could breathe again. Wiping her brow, she longed for a cool drink. She looked down into the small valley before them and realized they'd found an oasis. A small lake was surrounded by a patch of green, which contrasted with the vista of beige dunes all around them. On that green patch was settled a small, sand-colored town. It was bustling with life, its buildings supplemented by ruby-colored tents and its streets full of people. "Let me guess, the auction is down there?" she asked, pointing at the oasis. "I heard your kind was smart," he replied. "Come on, it's not far, and we can get you out of the suns for a while, until they call you for the block." The block. Gilly considered running, but she had nothing left inside her. She could barely walk, her limbs drooping, her eyes bleary. Too many days of deprivation, too many sore muscles, and most of all, too much iron holding her back. She followed the demon along the sandy street that weaved between the outbuildings, too tired to even swivel her head to take in her surroundings. A tent like any of the others they'd passed rose in front of her, and she realized that the demon had pulled them to a halt. "Got one for the auction," he told the creature stationed at the tent flap. Gilly lifted her head to take in the mass of muscles in front of her. Its armor was dull, almost blending in with its grayish skin and shaggy mullet of hair that reminded her of a bull's. The tusks added to the effect, as did the nose, which was more snout than anything. It eyed the demon, and she saw a droop of drool fall from one of its protruding tusks. "You'll have to file with the auctioneer. It's like to be bringing a new edition." "Apologies," the demon said, flashing a charming smile. "If you'll just point me in his direction after I get this one settled." He shoved Gilly through the flap and into the tent. She blinked at the dimness, taking in a dozen or more shadowy forms arrayed around her. "There's an empty spot." The demon tugged her closer to the tent wall, picking up a set of chains from the floor. He quickly snapped one around her neck, then pinned them around her hands and ankles. "You sit tight," he said, pushing on her shoulder until she fell to her knees. "Before long, you'll be on the block and someone else's problem, and I'll have more than enough diamonds to make it worth my while." She watched his back as he left, the tent's interior lighting up for a moment as he opened the flap, long enough for her to scan the faces of those locked up inside with her before the dimness returned. In the quiet she could hear weeping and sniffling, and defeat covered her. Her shoulders drooped, and she fell back on her behind, figuring she'd better take the opportunity to rest while she had it. "Who knows what will claim me next," she thought. "Maybe one of those nasty things like the one guarding the exit." There was a heavy sniff from the figures beside her, and a watery gasp that pained her heart. "It's okay," she said softly, reaching out to pat her shoulder. The figure flinched from her, then a feminine voice gave an apology. "I'm a bit jumpy. You'll have to forgive me." "I'm the one who needs forgiving," Gilly replied. "I should not have touched you without your permission. I only wanted to offer comfort." "Something in short supply," another female voice said from beyond her. Gilly blinked at the dimness as her eyes adjusted, and she could take in her companions. The one closest to her was a slight thing, a human, she noticed. Gilly had seen humans once before, when the crone had invited them into her hut for who knew what. They were a weak race, which was why it was assumed they didn't show up in the web very often. This one had light gray eyes and auburn hair. "My name is Gilly," she said, introducing herself with more confidence than she felt. "I got involved against my will with a backstabbing sorceress and a traitorous demon. Here we are." The human blinked at her, but she thought she made out a smile on the other one's face. It was a lovely face, exactly symmetrical, with wide green eyes and hair the color of spun gold in firelight. The skin was so clear and pure that it had an inner glow, like mine, like all Fae. "I'm Holly," the human said, her voice shaking. "I've never met a sorceress or a demon. Those things, they're not supposed to be real." "If those types impress you, wait until you see what else we've got in the web." The other woman leaned forward, her chains rattling as she did. "I'm Phaedra, Watcher of the Well of Wonders," she said in an official tone, then broke into a smile. "I know. It sounds silly, right?" Gilly chuckled, shrugging a shoulder. "I was impressed, actually." "I don't know how you can be laughing at a time like this," Holly whispered in an uneven tone. "We're about to be sold to monsters by monsters. For who knows what purpose?" "They could eat us," Phaedra volunteered. "There are worse things than being eaten," Gilly said evenly. "Like the guy outside the tent. Just imagine being a piece of his armor. That sounds like true torture." Phaedra laughed again, and Holly sighed, turning away. "It's just gallows humor," she said. "A way to blow off steam while waiting for the worst to happen." Phaedra reached out to put an arm around her, and that was when Gilly caught sight of a sliver of golden lace. "Wings? You have wings," she said, unable to stop herself. Pieces clicked into place in her mind. This is why the demon was insistent that I wasn't Fae, because a species like mine with wings do exist. They aren't just a myth or a fairy tale. "I'm Fae," Phaedra said, confirming her theory. "And I'm wondering what an elf is doing at a slave auction." "You should have no problem evading a sorceress and a demon, considering you rarely see elves on their own. Your brothers and cousins should have put an end to your enemies before you reached this awful place." "I'm not an elf. I'm Fae, too." Phaedra's eyes widened, her mouth opened to speak, but a sudden clatter at the entrance interrupted her. The nasty beast from outside was now inside, his filthy armor grinding against itself to make a racket. "You're leading the show, ladies," the guard said, grabbing the end of Gilly's chain and pulling them all onto their feet in one swift and strong motion. "The auctioneer knows where he's going to make the most money, and he's not about wasting his time." They were dragged into the sunlight, and Gilly blinked blindly, trying to adjust to the brightness as she was forced to jog to keep up with their jailer. By the time they reached the block and the crowd surrounding it, her vision had cleared. Gilly caught sight of the demon who'd brought her here, and watched as he fell in line behind them, trying to catch the guard's attention. "You didn't get her to bring out her rings. That's the only way to get top dollar out of her." His whine seemed to irritate the guard, who shoved him out of his way with the force of a falling log. The demon collapsed, letting out a groan of pain. All eyes were on them as they were led to the short set of stairs leading up to the block. Their jailer picked up the human and placed her on the block, bypassing the steps entirely. "Human female, less than 20 rotations, virgin. Bidding starts at a fistful of rubies." Gilly looked to where the auctioneer stood. He was a tall man with slick back hair and a long robe that disguised his form so that she couldn't be sure what manner of creature he was. His voice picked up volume and speed as the bids came rolling in. Holly was clutching herself on the block, eyes wide and full of fright. Her fear only seemed to drive up the bidding, and Gilly was sick at the scene. "We're not slaves. We will not be sold." Unfortunately, she had no power to stop what was happening. Her magic was blocked, her strength evaporated. She was about to become the thing she detested most, a victim. There was a sudden trumpeting of horns, a chilling sound that echoed off the buildings around the small amphitheater where they were stationed. Dust rose all around them, like smoke, encircling the crowd and the block in an instant. The ground shook gently at first, but in moments rumbling like an earthquake. Shadows appeared in the dust, one larger than the giant Willa had battled in the exchange. It burst from the dust, a massive warhammer clutched in his grip, hanging above his head, ready to strike. "Raiders!" someone screamed, and the auction descended into chaos. Chapter 5. Gilly could do little more than watch as warriors burst from the dust to attack. The guards were their main target, each as big and ugly as the one who'd kept tabs on his merchandise in the tent. But it quickly became evident that they were no match for the giant and his lethal band of raiders. "He's magnificent," Gilly thought, as she watched the 9-foot-tall fighter move through his forms. Magnificent and terrifying. She wasn't thinking so much about his appearance as his abilities. Lightning speed combined with ferocious strength and what looked an almost instinctual knowledge of how to hit his enemy and hit them hard. His appearance, on the other hand, was nothing short of terrifying. Just like the things he's doing with that hammer. Gilly watched him swing it with a look on his face that was something akin to joy. It impacted into the helmet of a guard, felling him with one swoop. He was 9 feet of rippling muscle covered by bronze skin, his dark hair pulled back in an intricate braid decorated with gold beads. Shirtless, his strapping chest was exposed so she could watch the interplay of muscles as he mowed down his opponents. "He's the most powerful warrior I've ever seen." He was also the fiercest. A set of white tusks protruded past his bottom lip, matching the horns that sprouted from his head, curving from just behind his temples to past his face, reminding her of an ancient bull she'd seen depicted in a moldy tapestry in the crone's hut. He was a monster, without a doubt, and he had a little regard for the blood he was spilling. Then his dark eyes met hers, and something passed between them, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She felt a tug on her chain and looked away, breaking the current of electricity that had seemed to run between them. Phaedra had their chain in her hand. "This is our chance. We go now, while the slavers are distracted." Gilly gave a short nod, then picked up as much of the chain between her and Holly that she could. She followed the other Fae when Phaedra set out with a burst of speed away from the auction block and back in the direction of the tent they'd been led from. Holly looked lost, her eyes wide like a startled doe. Gilly grabbed her arm and pulled her along, urging her to run with all her strength. "We're not going to get much time before they're after us," Phaedra said over her shoulder. "We need to pick up the pace." "This blasted iron is holding me back," Gilly huffed, tugging at the collar around her neck. "I know the feeling," Phaedra said. "I've got iron around my ankle." Gilly's eyes shot to the Fae's trim ankles and noticed a plain iron cuff fastened tightly above one of them.
"Why would they come after us? They're fighting the guards."
Holly looked confused, but she was keeping pace with them. "Why would they attack an auction if not for the items on the block?" Phaedra's voice was harsh. "The guards are only a momentary distraction. If we don't put on some speed, they'll find us before we can find a place to hide." Gilly felt the truth in Phaedra's words. There was nothing about the oasis that said it was rich in anything other than water and slaves. "We can't go any faster," she said, her breath sawing out of her. She gripped her side as a cramp started to contract her muscles painfully. "Maybe these can help," Phaedra said, unfurling her lacy wings and pulsing them. "Let's go, ladies." Phaedra's wings propelled her forward, bringing Gilly and Holly along with her. They moved faster, heading toward a spot ahead where the street became sand. "We're not heading to the dunes, are we?" Gilly asked, her stomach roiling. "We'll be too easy to spot against all that sand." "What choice have we got?" her Fae companion replied. "It will take them less than 10 minutes to search the oasis, and the only building we've seen the inside of was the rotten tent. They won't be able to tell where we've gone, especially with my wings blowing away our trail." Dusty streets gave way to sand dunes as they ran, the noise of the battle dropping to a dull roar echoing between the buildings of the oasis they were quickly leaving behind.
These chains are heavy, Holly moaned, her face red. It appeared humans were not blessed with the same athleticism as Fae were. We could get farther without them. Unless you have a key tucked into a hidden pocket of that charming strange ensemble you're wearing, Gilly said, wasting precious breath. I don't see that happening. The human was attired in tight-fitting pants of the same material the demon who'd brought her here had been wearing. It was dark blue and looked durable, as well as fashionable. Her sleeveless top was printed with an unfamiliar language. Together, the outfit looked casual and functional. Why am I thinking about fashion when I'm running for my life? Gilly shook her head, returning her attention to climbing the dune without slipping back down in the shifting sands. Her mind and body were exhausted, her thoughts coming sudden and strange. Like what happened with that giant monster back at the auction block. Come on, girls, Phaedra exhorted as she crested the dune. I think I see a cave in the distance. She barreled down the dune so quickly Gilly lost her footing and slid to the bottom on her own bottom. Standing, she gritted her teeth in pain as she furiously rubbed at her behind. Where is it? Where's the cave? Holly looking around frantically. Phaedra's beautiful brow was furrowed. I'm not sure. I saw it from the top of the dune. But now that we're here, it's gone. A mirage, Gilly croaked, her strength deserting her. Not being the type to give up, she told herself that she could keep going, but her knees were wobbling. The heat was oppressive, and the sand chafed at her feet when she ran. Let's not forget that I haven't had anything to eat or drink in 5 days. The next dune, Phaedra said, her tone more determined than her body looked to Gilly's eyes. The Fae was breathing heavily, her wings drooping as they stood there. There might be something over there that... The sand around them started to swirl, rising in a cloud of dust. Gilly shaded her eyes against the grit flying around the air around her. What in the 17 hells? She saw the shape in the dust cloud, a second before it burst out with a roar that had her wincing. Phaedra snapped into action, pulling at the chain to propel them away from the monster and his sinister warhammer, but Gilly knew they were no match for the creature who towered over them. His hammer was strapped to his back, leaving his hands free to grab the end of the chain that connected them all from where it sat in the sand. Gilly grabbed it, hoping to jerk it out of his hands before he could get a solid grip, but he was faster than she was in her exhausted, iron-bound state. He whipped the chain around them quicker than lightning, binding them around their waists and forcing the women to cluster together. Without a word, the monstrous male hefted them by the chain, slinging them over his broad shoulder. Gilly found her face pressed against the warm skin of his back. She managed to maneuver herself so that she could look over his shoulder ahead of them. Having secured his prey, their captor shot off across the desert, moving fast enough to make the world around them a huge beige blur. Moments later, Gilly found herself back in the amphitheater where the auction was taking place. Before the raiders had descended, the sandstone seats had risen in a dozen rows, creating a semicircle with an opening where the auction block was placed. The rows were now empty, the crowd having fled rather than fight. The bodies scattered over the space between the seats, and the block overwhelmingly belonged to the nasty grey creatures who'd served as guards for the auction. She let out an oof when the ground suddenly rose up to meet her. Gilly rolled over, shoving at the chain wrapped around her waist and slowly coming to her feet. She blinked at the cloud of dust the monster had created through his rapid transit and seemed to have disappeared into. She bent to assist the human in standing, then started brushing the sand and dust out of her clothing. 2 shirtless males with identical pointy goatees were chatting while another dragged a line of smaller beings to the center of the amphitheater. They were connected by a chain, as Gilly was to her group, and seemed to be comprised of creatures of short stature. Several had the bright red hair and green attire she knew belonged to the leprechauns. How did a gang of the wee folk end up in this crap hole? She wondered to herself before remembering that she was one of 2 Fae stranded here. A commotion drew her attention, and she turned her head to take in the source of the noise. The being with the slicked black hair, who'd served as the auctioneer, was in an intense conversation with a trio of shirtless raiders.
Gilly noticed then that each of the raiders had a tattoo on their right shoulder, a collection of shapes in brazen red ink that made no sense to her. "You're crippling my business," the auctioneer howled, throwing up his hands. "You've hit my last 3 auctions. Now I have to replace my workforce yet again." "Solomon warned you about using Horde members as your minions," the raider with a bright white topknot admonished him in response. "If you continue to use those devils, you can expect another raid during your next auction." "Who is one such as he to give me orders?" the auctioneer replied, hands on his hips. "Even the Archon himself has not outlawed the Horde in the realm. I am Solomon, Hammer of the Dunes. Some call me the Second Son, others the Scourge of the Sands." The nonchalant words came from a figure who sauntered out of the lingering dust cloud, attired in a long white cloak, embroidered in gold thread above baggy sand-colored slacks, and a matching vest that left his chest exposed. Gilly's heart beat harder as she took in his handsome visage. Tightly braided dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and a strong jaw complemented his dark eyes and bronze skin. He was tall, his shoulders broad and strong, and the muscles of his bare torso glistened with a veneer of sweat. Despite his size, he was finely made, and in spite of her current condition, Gilly couldn't help but feel the sting of arousal admiring the raider's form. Reality intruded quickly, puncturing the moment, as the auctioneer dropped to his knees. The haughty man pressed his forehead to the sand, his muscles trembling. "I meant no disrespect," he said from his cower, holding up his hands in surrender. "I was merely commenting on the realm's laws, not complaining." A half-smile graced Solomon's face. "I prefer Solomon's laws, which clearly state that the Horde are an abomination which must be snuffed out. Your merchandise is forfeit its punishment for breaking this law." A high keening sound came out of the auctioneer. He lifted his head but remained on his knees. "Please, you cannot! I was forced to borrow vast funds to gather these creatures for the auction, not to mention being forced to relocate the auction again as a precaution." "One that didn't pay off," the raider with the snow-colored topknot said with a chuckle. Solomon ignored the auctioneer's whining, walking past the man and toward Gilly and her companions. He stopped in front of Phaedra, a wide smile on his face. "I'd heard rumors that a Fae was among the items on offer." His eyes swept over her wings and his grin widened. "Fae fetch high prices in almost any market. You'll bring in riches that will please my men." Phaedra spat at his feet. "I will be no man's slave." He stared at her, grin still in place. "You'll learn not to waste water so capriciously in the desert." Gilly was impressed by the man's calm demeanor. He has the audacity to examine the spoils of battle on the battlefield itself. Her eyes scanned the roads and buildings beyond the amphitheater and found no hints of life. Everyone must be cowering inside, afraid to face Solomon and his handful of raiders. The man in question moved past the Fae to Holly. Tucking a finger under her chin, he lifted her face to his gaze. "A human?" There was a trace of disappointment in his voice. "Oh well," he said, dropping his hand. "At least you're pretty." Gilly felt herself straightening when Solomon turned his attention to her. He took in her pointed ears, delicate bone structure, and attire. A look of confusion entered his face, and he leaned in and sniffed at her. Eyes widening, he straightened, anger filling his features. "Who took your wings?" he asked roughly, his voice like gravel. "I never had any," she replied, filling her voice with as much confidence as she could. "An elf, mayhaps?" Topknot had approached to stand just behind the raider, who was clearly in charge. "Pointed ears, small features." "It's a Fae," Solomon said with certainty. "I can smell it." "A Fae without wings?" Topknot replied with downturned lips. "They don't exist." "I'm here to tell you they do," Gilly said, but she kept her eyes on Solomon's dark ones. She saw a light enter his eyes, but could not tell what it signified. Surprise? Greed? Something else? "A wingless Fae, so rare as to be almost priceless." A delighted grin split his face. "And I know who will pay the highest price for her. Our Prince of Darkness will be pleased." Chapter 6. The wagon went over another bump and Gilly gritted her teeth, trying to ignore the pain coursing through her beleaguered body. She'd adjusted her limbs, refolding them within the confines of the iron cage they'd tossed her in. Phaedra glanced in her direction from within her own cage, her eyes then flitting to Holly, who sat between them, her chains considered enough to hold her, unlike the Fae she travelled with. Gilly wasn't sure how long she'd been riding in the wagon in which the raiders had stashed their booty before leaving the oasis. One of the suns that had been above her head was now sitting close to the horizon, giving the world around her an orangish glow. She licked her lips, wishing for a drop of moisture to wet her mouth, and understanding the remark Solomon had made to Phaedra earlier. The desert had the driest conditions she'd ever faced, and her lack of hydration was making her head ache. Her eyes fluttered closed, and she leaned her head back against the bars of her cage. She fought slumber for as long as she could, wanting to stay alert, but the dunes all looked the same, and the chance of her being able to retrace her steps back to the oasis were fading. What point would there be in retracing my steps? I've got to find someone who can get me off this world and back to my home. Convincing herself it was better to conserve her energy and rest before she confronted whatever came next, Gilly allowed herself to relax. Moments later, she fell into sleep. A dream unfolded as she slipped into unconsciousness, a dream of her favorite grove of trees in the Fae Wilds. She sat on a branch, dangling her legs among the leaves as she watched the sun sinking behind the hills in the distance. "I should have guessed I would find you here," her voice said, and Gilly started, looking down to find her twin sister on the ground waving up at her. Although it was something she'd noticed in the past, Gilly paid little conscious attention to what happened in her dreams. She'd always been able to situate herself where she wanted during her slumber, to travel the wilds in a flash, to avoid nightmares by simply realizing they were part of a dream and banishing them with a wave of her hand. But something about this dream felt different. She watched as Lena climbed to join her, noticing that her sister's skills had improved. Poor Adelina had been sent to live with the city-dwelling Fae as part of their mother's convoluted plan for revenge against her estranged mate. A plan that had been concocted as a result of the evil sorcerer Rashawn's plot to seize the Fae Realm and the Queen's powers. During her time among the city-dwellers, Lena had suppressed her natural abilities while among them, but her time in the wilds had led her to remembering her athleticism. "Where are you?" her sister asked when she'd taken her seat beside her. "Right here," Gilly answered, cocking an eyebrow in confusion. Lena shook her head. "No, darling sister, you're not, at least not physically." "What are you talking about?" Gilly said, a note of irritation entering her voice. "It seems I can't even get a moment's peace in my dreams." "This is a dream. You're not actually here." "I know that," Gilly snapped and took a deep breath. "Apologies, it's been a long week." "None needed," Lena said, putting an arm around her. "I'm just glad I could finally reach you. Our friend Willa must have found a way to block me." The way she said friend let Gilly know her sister considered the woman anything but. "I saw you once, but Willa was in control of the dream. She seemed to have you locked in some kind of semi-conscious state." Gilly frowned, her hands automatically going to her hair to run her fingers through it. She remembered her time in captivity with its long days in the sweltering shack and its even longer nights, caught in a dream that was just as much a prison. Her normal abilities had deserted her, and she'd spent night after night staring into a mirror. She'd begun brushing her hair and counting the strokes for no reason she could understand, and although the dream felt nightmarish, she couldn't force herself to wake. Gilly's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about? You saw me. You are me. At least, you're a manifestation of my dream." "Not exactly," Lena gave her a smile. "I'm dreamwalking. This is me, the real me. I managed to find your dream finally tonight, for the first time since you were taken." "Dreamwalking? What nonsense is this?" "Something I picked up from our enemy, actually." Lena explained how they tried to locate Lynetta in her dreams to question her about Vel. He'd turned out to be the sorcerer Rashawn in disguise. Now that I know how to do it, I've been trying to locate your dreams to find you and try to determine where Willa took you." You no longer need the answer to that question, Gilly admitted. At her sister's quizzical glance, she continued, I'm no longer in Willa's clutches. You escaped, Lena cried, bouncing with excitement. I should have known you'd find a way. Not exactly, Gilly had to admit. She quickly filled Lena in on her imprisonment and Willa's betrayal at the hands of the demon they'd met in the exchange. He planned to sell me in a slave auction, but raiders had second thoughts. I'm presently in a cage on the back of their wagon, an iron collar making it impossible for me to access my magic. From bad to worse, from the sounds of it, Lena murmured. She pulled Gilly into a sudden fierce hug. It isn't fair. We'd just been reunited. I barely had any time with you. We have time here now, Gilly said, hoping to cheer her twin up. For as long as the dream lasts, Lena reminded her. Our parents are worried. King Lear, that is to say, father, she interrupted herself, shaking her head. I'm still getting used to calling him that. Father has gathered every allied off-worlder he knows to his court and given them orders to keep an eye out for you. He's even sent pairs of Fae, one wildling and one city dweller each off-world to search for you. But the web is wide, as you know, and finding you is harder than finding a silver needle in a haystack the size of the royal palace. And mother? Gilly asked, finding it just as strange to use that word in relation to the Fae Queen, who had raised her in the guise of the ancient crone. Extremely worried and angry. She spends most of her time locked away in her hut, scrying for you. Gilly's heart contracted with sadness. Our new family didn't even have a chance to unite before that leaving sorceress stepped in and screwed everything up. Lena patted her hand gently. We're going to bring you home, but if you could give us a clue as to your whereabouts, it would make things infinitely easier. With a sigh, Gilly hung her head. If I could tell you, I would. I haven't yet seen a signpost or marker to let me know the name of a town, let alone the realm itself. Only endless sand dunes and a rough sorta who inhabit the realm. The image of Solomon flashed into her mind, but she banished it, something inside her making her want to keep quiet about her captor for the time being. Keep an eye out and an ear open, Lena told her. Any clues you can provide may end up being the one we need to find you. Gilly started speaking, telling her sister about the sands, the oasis, and the suns that hung overhead, but those were the only details she had to share. There isn't much to go on, she apologized. Something is better than nothing. Lena put her head on her sister's shoulder and sat quietly. Together they watched the sun sink and twilight begin to paint the wilds in blues and purples. After a while, her sister lifted her head and turned to her. There was something I forgot to mention about the dream with Willa. She called herself the... Whatever her sister had been about to say was lost. Gilly jolted awake, her eyes blinking into the darkness. Unsure of what might have woken her, she peered into the night, trying to cling to the dream and the closeness she'd felt with her twin for those few precious moments. Her cage sat in the sand, not far from Phaedra's. They were a few paces away from a small fire where several figures sat slumped. I must have slept through the camp's setup, she realized. I don't think I have ever been so exhausted. Her muscles were screaming at her, her limbs again forced into an uncomfortable position within the cage. She'd still not had a drink or a bite to eat in days, and her head continued to pound. It ached almost as badly as her chest, where her heart was currently collapsing in on itself with sadness. Gilly had faced many challenges in her time as the crown's acolyte and leader of the Winking Hand, not to mention the forces that kept the wilds safe. She was used to long marches, to arduous physical conditions, but what she wasn't familiar with was long periods of forced helplessness. Always on the go, she was now being forced to remain still, to let events happen to her instead of taking charge of the situation. Tears pricked her eyelids, and she let out a sniffle. I'm just tired and hungry and missing my home. But the words she told herself didn't make her feel any better. Deep down, she considered herself weak. All of her famed strength had deserted her, leaving her powerless, unable to help herself or the others imprisoned alongside her. Tears streamed down her cheeks, unchecked as she gave in to despair. What could make such a strong woman weep? Said a voice in the darkness. Gilly pivoted to peer into the darkness. A pair of shining eyes were coming closer. although she could not hear footsteps. When the figure crouched next to the cage, she could finally make out its features. Solomon? Gilly fought back a shiver and braced herself for conversation with the warrior. But there was something in his eyes that were dark in the light of the suns, but now shone with a faint red glow that battered its way through her defenses. She'd never felt this vulnerable, and her usual calm facade slipped. "I'm not strong, not anymore," she whispered, brushing the tears from her face. She fought the urge to curl into a ball, but only barely. "That's nonsense," Solomon answered with an indulgent chuckle, his voice soft but his tone sure. "I'm an excellent judge of character, and I know a fighter when I see one. And I've seen many, but never one with your grit." Gilly let out a bark of humorous laughter. "You've had me chained and in a cage. What chance have I had to demonstrate this grit you speak of, O scourge of the sands?" "You don't like that one, huh?" he said with a smile. "Don't tell anyone, but I made that one up myself." She shook her head, fighting against amusement. In spite of herself, he was raising her spirits. "Why are you doing this?" she asked seriously. "Why would a brutal captor like yourself waste kind words on a prisoner?" "It isn't a waste, at least where you're concerned." Gilly blinked into the darkness, blindsided by the comment. Strange emotions uncurled inside her like a cat after a nap. But the cat was soon tossed outdoors into the rainstorm when he continued. "I'm only trying to preserve your value, to keep your face skin clear and beautiful, and your delicate ears from drooping so you'll fetch a higher price." Gilly deflated, leaning her head back against the cage and looking away. "Tell me about this prince you plan to sell me to." "The princes of darkness are discerning fellows," he said, his tone even. "They will only accept the best. Anything less—" he dragged a finger across his throat. Coldness filled her insides. There was a jangle of chains as one of the figures near the fire shifted, and Solomon came out of his crouch. "Try to get some rest. I'm not sure how much you'll be afforded in the prince's palace." He walked away from her, his footsteps silent. Chapter 7. It was late afternoon, at least it seemed so. Gilly had yet to figure out how long the days were on this world where two suns dominated the skies. She blinked at the rays that had heated the bars of the cage enough for her to avoid touching them. They'd been rolling past sand dunes since the wagon was loaded this morning, and the sameness of the scenery revealed no secrets about her whereabouts. "Do either of you know what realm we're in?" she'd asked when she'd woken up the second time and been loaded into the wagon beside Phaedra's cage. Holly had kept as close as her chains allowed, having been added to the chain gang of leprechauns and other small creatures. "Realm?" Holly asked distractedly, tugging the chain away from a leering leprechaun, who'd used it to move himself closer, apparently to ogle her. "I cannot say for certain," Phaedra replied, her nose scrunched up. "If I had to guess by the stench, I'd say we were in a hell realm." Gilly had sat up straight at that response. "One of the 17? Do you truly think that possible?" Phaedra replied with a lazy lift of one shoulder. "It's as good a guess as any, given the creatures that populate this place, like the members of the Horde who were employed to guard us." Remembering what her captor had said about the Horde, Gilly had probed further. "What is the Horde exactly?" "It is a host of unnatural devils such as the one that guarded our tent. They're foul, unintelligent, and driven by greed. It was said that Shaitan created them to serve as his army when he still planned to overrun heaven. The invasion didn't go as planned, and the Horde was scattered, forced to make their own way through the web after disappointing their master." Shaitan, Gilly mouthed to herself. She had heard of the one said to be the ultimate evil in the web, but little about him had been known in the Fae Realm. Her musings were interrupted when Holly let out a cry of anger and shoved the leprechaun over the side of the wagon, causing the rest of the chain to unspool and several other green-clad mini-men to follow him to the ground. She was once again thinking about the evil one as they made their way around a dune. Can the Shaitan character be any worse than his horde or the raiders that wiped him out? And then there's the Prince of Darkness Solomon plans to hand me off to. Gilly tried to tell herself she'd seen the worst of things, but she knew it was likely a lie. The worst is yet to come. "Look!" Gilly raised her eyes as the other Faes shout, taking in a structure the same color as the dunes that surrounded it. There were windows, she realized, and a metal door wide enough for 2 wagons to enter at once. She had a feeling they'd reached their destination. As if to confirm her suspicion, the doors opened of their own accord to welcome them. She paid close attention to her surroundings as the wagon made its way through the entrance, flanked by the handful of raiders with Solomon at their head. The doors opened into a small, dust-covered courtyard with an archway through which she could see wooden stalls. Assuming it was the stables, she focused her attention on the wooden door across from her. If I get a chance to escape, I'll need to memorize every inch of this place. Gilly was relieved to finally have details to catalog, since her journey through the dunes had been so disorienting in its lack of anything but shifting sands. Coming to a stop, the wagon was efficiently emptied. Those on the long chain were led to the wooden door, while Phaedra and Gilly, the only ones in iron cages, were picked up by 2 muscled raiders and carried inside like luggage. The interior of the structure was awish in a refreshing coolness, and Gilly wiped the sweat off her brow, relieved to finally be out from under the boiling heat of 2 suns. Her eyes were wide as she was carried down a whitewashed corridor, the walls featuring intricate tapestries at intervals along the way. The hallway ended in a polished table holding a piece of art made of some precious metal, expertly molded into climbing tendrils that reminded her of smoke over flames. The raiders carrying the cages took a left, then walked into an ornately decorated room that clashed with its occupants. Low-slung sofas and cushioned chairs were scattered around the room, which seemed to run the length of that side of the house. There were columns and arches and a mosaic tile ceiling that was a burst of color against the white of the walls. Priceless works of art covered any available surface, including an intricate set of drinking glasses that looked as if they were carved out of solid ruby. Gilly scanned the space, but there was no sign of Solomon. Fear pricked her, and she wondered whether they'd been brought straight to the prince's palace. The furnishings were expensive enough to belong to royalty, she figured, even if the square footage was smaller than she imagined. She chewed her bottom lip nervously, watching the raiders unlock the chains of the other prisoners. One raider with shoulders almost as wide as the doorway was directing the leprechauns and their ilk out of the far door as soon as they were freed, grabbing one by the collar to toss it out into the hallway when it tried to run away. She was distracted from the scene at the scraping sound of a key in the lock on the outside of her cage. It was the man she'd come to think of as Topknot. "Don't bother trying to flee. You're easier to catch than swamp fever." The door swung open and Gilly took a cautious step out of her cage. Topknot gave the same warning to Phaedra, then released her, eyeing both Fae warily despite his gruff words. "You're headed to the bards, along with the human. Got to clean you up so we can see the goods with a clear eye." Gilly pursed her lips, not accustomed to being objectified. "Someone ought to clean you up to confirm that you're not a talking pile of a file." Topknot's eyes widened at her outburst, but Phaedra laughed loudly, doubling over in merriment. "I agree with her assessment, but kindly wait until after we use the tub because I don't think they'll be able to clean it after you've had a bath." The raider's expression turned stormy, and he let out a growl, but Gilly's anger outweighed any fright that he might engender. She stared him down, and finally he shook his head and turned away. "Follow me, and keep your mouths shut." Crooking his finger at Holly, who was now out of her chains, he motioned for her to fall in line behind him. Gilly took up a position at the rear, scoping out their route from the large sitting room to the bars. Her brain was screaming at her to slow, to fade into the shadows, but she knew that without her magic, she didn't have a chance of going unnoticed here. She trudged along, hoping the bars would present her with a way to free herself from the collar. Topknot opened a door and motioned them through. Gilly found herself on a stone landing with steps leading down to a stone floor with a hollowed-out bowl containing steaming water. "Use the soap and don't drown yourself," the raider commanded, then slammed the door behind them. She heard the key slide into the lock, then his footsteps as he departed. The tightness in her chest eased slightly now that she was free to move around and was no longer under the gaze of a half-dozen jailers. She followed Phaedra down the stairs and to the small pool. "Water!" the Fae cried out with relief, grabbing for the glass pitcher situated on a small table. Gilly was unable to take in anything else about the chamber they'd entered because her eyes were fastened on the glasses Phaedra was filling with water. Water they could actually drink, she hoped. She picked one up and passed it to Holly, who eyed it with skepticism. "It's clean," Phaedra said, setting down the pitcher to pick up her own glass. "I'd smell it if it were poisoned." The Fae quickly downed her own glass and let out a sigh of pure ecstasy. Phaedra's example was good enough for Gilly. She gulped down the cool, clear water and smiled, not caring about the slight pain of her lips from their dryness. Although Fae were hardly folk who could survive for long periods without food and drink, it wasn't a comfortable existence. The water revived her, and she nodded encouragingly to Holly, who at last took a drink of her own. "I can't wait to finally be clean again," Phaedra said, admiring the pool of steaming water before them. The Fae wasted little time stripping off her dirty clothing and dipping a toe in. "It's warm," she said, then sniffed at the air. "A natural hot spring." She slid into the pool and let out a long sigh of delight. Gilly noticed a long dresser filled with fluffy towels, a selection of soaps, and a multitude of other grooming items. She walked over to select a bar of soap, holding it up to her nose to inhale a faintly floral scent. The bath chamber wasn't what she'd expected. In fact, the entire building so far had been unexpectedly comfortable and well-appointed. She slowly removed her clothing, wishing she had a clean set to put on to replace them. "At least my body'll be clean," she told herself. About to enter the pool herself, she paused when she saw Holly cowering near a corner, her arms wrapped around herself. "I hope this isn't considered immodest where you're from," Gilly said gently. "We'll give you plenty of room and face away from you if you prefer." Holly gave her a sheepish smile. "I appreciate that, but nudity isn't entirely taboo where I'm from. It's just, what if there are cameras?" Phaedra and Gilly looked at each other. "Cameras," the other Fae repeated, the words sounding unfamiliar to her. Gilly shared her ignorance, following up with a, "What do you mean?" "You know," Holly said, coming forward and gesturing vaguely. "Little devices that record what's going on. I always imagined human traffickers would use some kind of surveillance to watch their—" Her words trailed off when she saw their looks of confusion. She let out a soft chuckle. "I guess you guys don't have those around here, huh?" Gilly shrugged. "I've never heard of them." Holly seemed relieved by that answer and started to remove her own clothing. Shyly, she came forward on legs as long and slender as a young deer's. Gilly preceded her into the pool, holding out her hand to offer support. Holly took it, then carefully entered the pool, sinking into the water to her shoulders and closing her eyes in relief. Gilly moved to the far end of the pool and found that a ledge had been carved there, so she sat and leaned against the smooth stone wall, extending her arms out to either side and almost purring in satisfaction. "You know, ladies, it pains me to say it, but relaxing in a slaver's spring is the most pampered I've felt in ages." Phaedra reached for the bar of soap Gilly had set by the side of the pool and began lathering up her arms. "I've gotten so used to being in the rough that I forgot about creature comforts." "The rough?" Holly asked, taking the words out of Gilly's mouth. Phaedra nodded. "It's an area known for being a little, well, rough. I'm its unofficial sheriff of sorts. At least, that's the way I see it." Her voice softened a little at the end, as if she were talking more to herself than to her companions. "I was there looking for an old friend who hadn't been home in a while. I was caught off guard, and then, wham! I woke up here in this bloody forsaken realm being prepped for sale." Gilly guarded her expression. There were enough holes in that story to sink a three-masted ship. "Do you know how you got here?" "A demon who could teleport brought me." Phaedra shook her head. "I have my suspicions, but have no way to confirm them." Her face was dark, and Gilly thought that maybe she wasn't on the best of terms with whoever she thought might be to blame.
An actual demon, Holly said, her hand to her chest and her eyes wide with fear. I thought you were just saying that back in the tent, but you mean a real living demon.
Horns and all, Gilly replied with a nod. He was supposed to be taking me to Eden. Well, the sorceress wanted to go to Eden, and was taking me with her, against my will. The demon decided to double-cross her, keep her diamonds and sell me off, but I guess she got the last laugh because the diamonds weren't real.
A demon in Eden? Phaedra let out a low whistle. That's a dangerous fair indeed. No wonder your demon transport decided against going there. And I thought I had it bad, Holly said, taking the soap that Phaedra handed off to her. There are no demons or sorcerers where I come from, at least that I know of, she hedged. But apparently there are vampires. One came to me as I was leaving campus one night, said I was in danger. The only thing I felt in danger of was his horrible fangs biting into my neck. There was a hitch in Holly's voice, but she pushed on. I ran and he chased me, pinning me up against the wall outside the library. He stared at me, and his eyes, they changed somehow, and that's when he told me that he was my destiny, his eternal mate. Gilly's gasp was echoed by Phaedra's own. Oh, honey, I'm sorry, the Fae said, putting a hand on Holly's shoulder. You're lucky to still be here. Holly nodded, visibly swallowing. I knew I had to get away, but I trusted the wrong people. They promised I would be safe here, but I realize now that they just traded me to that foul auctioneer to clear some debt of theirs. But at least the vampire didn't get me. Her small, anguished voice filled Gilly with pity. She wanted to hug the woman, but she restrained herself, hoping her words would comfort her better. No one should have to suffer at the hands of a leech. I will do everything in my power to not only free you, but to keep you safe from any bloodsuckers who try to come near you. Holly gave her a watery smile, then opened her mouth to respond, but the door at the top of the stairs creaked open, and Topknot's voice echoed down to them. Finish up and get dressed. There is clothing in the dresser. You're expected for dinner directly. All three women looked up at the sound of the door slamming shut again. Phaedra looked apoplectic at the thought of having to leave the pool. She made an obscene gesture at the door and shook her head. Pox-ridden raiders. No decorum at all. Chapter 8. Gilly adjusted the sleeves of the silk gown she found herself poured into. The delicate fabric felt wrong against her skin, having spent her life in homespun woolens and weaved grasses made from the materials the wilds offered up to its inhabitants. Wearing the dress felt like being slowly strangled. It's almost as bad as the collar. Phaedra, on the other hand, looked regal in the gown of false green she wore. I should have grabbed that one instead of this white monstrosity. Walking close to the torch sputtering on the wall, she noticed the material wasn't entirely opaque. Gilly suppressed a curse and turned to her companions. You both look spectacular, they did. The Fae's natural grace paired with, well, Holly's innocence. She was dressed in a sky-blue ensemble that fit her willowy form well. The human thanked her, telling Gilly she looked lovely as well, but there was a hint of a lie as white as Gilly's dress in her tone. Let's get this over with, Gilly said through gritted teeth. Then her stomach rumbled and was doubling over with its insistence. Whatever is about to happen, at least there will be food. That's the attitude to have, Phaedra said, as she struggled to adjust her wings to the dress she wore. What do you mean? Gilly asked, suddenly worried. Is the food horrible? The idea of eating live insects or sausages of congealed blood made her queasy. It's just as bad as the table manners. Dev are not known for their charming etiquette. Gilly's brow furrowed. Dev? Is that what these raiders are? Not all the raiders, just one in particular. I've seen his like before, although it has been centuries. They're brutal, vicious opponents. Her face held a sour expression. A Fae's worst enemy, to put it succinctly. Gilly suppressed a shudder at the memory of the towering monster that had burst out of the dust to lay waste to the horde. You fought them before? Is there no way to best them? She'd faced a myriad of enemies, including beasts of the Fae Wilds, who could swallow down one of her kind in a single gulp.
but she'd never heard of the Dev before, and from what she'd seen, a single fighter had taken out dozens on his own. "Long ago," Phaedra replied. "But then, I wasn't bogged down by this iron shackle. We don't stand a chance against him in this condition." "Have they any weaknesses to exploit?" As she thought getting the iron collar off her neck might be next to impossible, Gilly hoped there was another way she might escape the clutches of the raiders and the creature that had fought so ferociously. "There is one method, although I've never seen it happen, so it might be more myth than reality. The story goes that if you can entrap a Dev in a ring of silver and say its name, you can bend its will to your own." "A ring of silver?" Holly mused. "Do you mean you have to lure it into a silver ring, or that you have to put a ring of silver on its body?" "I'm not certain," Phaedra replied. "Myths and legends are never consistent, are they? In any event, we don't have any silver, so that plan seems unlikely. Then again, it might not be necessary, since we haven't seen that monstrous giant since the amphitheater. Maybe we left him behind." Phaedra gave her a confused expression, then blinked in understanding. "You mean—" She was interrupted by the harsh voice of Topknot from the landing above them again. "Whatever you're whispering about down there, we'll have to wait. Let's get going, ladies, or we'll be late." The three trudged up the stairs, holding their dresses as they went, and followed Topknot into the corridor. Plush carpet underfoot soothed some of the aches in her feet, still remaining after the bath. A few turns, and they were ushered through a large door at the end of the hall. Gilly's steps faltered when she walked in to find Solomon at the head of the table. His eyes met hers, and the corners of his lips turned up in a satisfied smile. Their host stood, beckoning toward the empty seats at the long, wooden table that had been polished enough to shine underneath the ornate chandelier above them. Gilly took the farthest seat from him she could find, reminding herself that he was her captor. Even without his pet monster, he was a formidable figure, his height edged close to 7 feet, his thick shoulders tapering to a muscular torso, now hidden by thin white linen, although the deep V in his robe did hint at what lay beneath. Brawny arms featured matching platinum bands around his biceps, and a delicate golden chain ran from his left ear to a small ring in his nostril. But his hair was his crowning glory. Thick waves of jet black fell down his back, not a strand out of place. His exotic appearance was matched by his faint accent as he welcomed his guests to the table. "Please, enjoy these meager offerings. I hope tonight's dinner can help make up for the deprivation you experienced under the hold." Gilly scanned the table, surprised to see that only the raiders had joined her and her companions. The leprechauns and other small creatures were nowhere to be seen. Solomon retook his seat, and 2 lanky youths in simple linen outfits began ferrying dishes to them. Olives, fresh fruit, and steaming meats soon lined the table, supplemented by sweet delicacies like folded pastries and candied nuts. Gilly's stomach growled loudly, echoing through the room and pulling Solomon's attention to her again, but she refused to touch the food until the host raised a pint of flatbread to his mouth. Having observed the customs of hospitality, Gilly tore into her food like a forest fire, consuming everything in her path. Having gone without food for nearly a week, she couldn't help herself from indulging in each dish and going back for seconds. "I will give your compliments to my cook," Solomon told her in an amused tone. Gilly looked up to see that everyone gathered at the table had eyes on her, their expressions ranging from surprise to mild disgust. Wiping her lips on the cloth napkin beside her gold-rimmed plate, she attempted to slow herself down. One of the youths placed a goblet of wine beside her, but she bypassed it for a glass of water that she emptied in seconds. Motioning for another, she reached across the table to snatch up a delicate pastry coated in honey. She popped it into her mouth and let out a moan of delight, then hid her blush behind her napkin, realizing what a spectacle she was making of herself. Conversation around the table was dominated by the raiders, who were discussing plans for another outing. Gilly listened with half an ear as she continued to stuff food into her mouth and chew with lightning speed. She caught Solomon's eyes on her again, his little grin starting to grate on her nerves. What's he looking at? If he'd bothered to give us anything to eat before now, he wouldn't have to see me diving into food like a pack of starving rabbits. I'm glad to see you're enjoying your meal, he said mildly, ignoring the discussion between his men. Shall I have my servants empty the larder to refill your plate? Gilly snorted. I'm certain that monstrous pet of yours eats more on a daily basis than I ever could. Solomon looked confused for a moment, then sat back with a thoughtful expression on his face. Topknot turned to scowl at her. Pet? What do you mean, girl? Gilly waved a hand holding a skewer of meat. You know, the big guy with the horns and the, setting down the skewers she mimed, having tusks protruding from her mouth. Phaedra grabbed her hand and squeezed it, shaking her head almost imperceptibly. Topknot threw his head back in laughter. That's not our pet! That's not the topic of conversation for tonight's dinner, Solomon cut in. Frustrated and confused by the interplay at the table, Gilly found herself giving in to her urge to complain. Pray tell, what are approved topics for a dinner party involving a violent raider and his captive slaves? A few wrinkles appeared on Solomon's otherwise smooth forehead. There is no reason we can't keep things polite, he said before taking a draw off his goblet. I understand there may be some differences of opinion between us. Difference of opinion? Her voice rose, and she abandoned eating to turn all of her attention to the man who planned to sell her off. What you're doing is wrong, plain and simple. And no artificial attempt at politeness and propriety is going to change that. That's enough. His voice was stern, his expression darkening. I won't have any table disturbed by petty whining. Whining? Gilly said, pushing herself up from her chair. I'll show you whining. She lunged in his direction, but Phaedra grabbed her by the shoulders and held her back. Solomon stood, his civil manner evaporating under the heat of his anger. Dinner is over. Gesturing toward Topknot, he commanded the women be taken to their quarters. Sleep well tonight, because tomorrow we set off for the Prince of Darkness's keep. Phaedra guided her toward the door, and she fell in line behind Topknot, whose expression said he wasn't sure whether to be stern or amused. That was fantastic, Phaedra whispered into her ear with a giggle. Gilly wasn't so sure of the other Fae's assessment. Her temper had gotten away from her, enraging Solomon into reminding her that she would soon be the property of someone even more powerful. I should have had more dessert before I told him off, she responded peevishly. Beneath the surface, though, anger was giving way to fear. Maybe it's a good thing, she told herself. At least I'll be rid of Solomon. The thought, however, didn't taste as sweet as she thought it would. When they arrived in the courtyard the next morning, Gilly was expecting to be loaded into the wagon again, but the creaking vehicle was nowhere around. Neither were the rest of their fellow prisoners. Solomon stood beside two of his men, all of them attired for desert travel, in flowing white pants and long-sleeve shirts in matching material. Their leader added a light brown vest that fell almost to his feet, accompanied by a scarf in the same color that sat lightly around his neck. Across their backs were sand-colored packs with supplies and their array of weapons. Gilly and her companions were dressed for travel as well in outfits not unlike their captors. The soft leather boots felt strange on her feet, accustomed as she was to traveling her force barefoot, but she imagined they'd stop her feet from blistering on the hot sands. We travel on foot, Solomon said, stepping forward to hand them each a scarf like his own. These will help keep the sand out and the shade in. On foot? Phaedra asked. I thought you were worried about your merchandise getting damaged. I am, which is why we aren't taking the wagon. We can be nimbler on our feet this way, avoiding the dangers that lie in wait for us. Oh, goody, Gilly murmured. A forced march across arid dunes. She jerked her head in the direction of his raiders. And only 2 men to accompany you. That seems risky. Solomon chuckled, a husky sound that made Gilly's ears tingle. Considering one dab is worth 10 of any other race, Fae included, I'm not worried. Her lips pressed together at his cocky response. She watched him pick up his pack, his long hair once again restrained in a complex braid. His men followed suit, and Solomon gestured for the 3 of them to follow. The wide doors opened to the dunes beyond, and their party made their way out into the heat of the day. Chapter 9. It wasn't even midday yet, and Gilly was tired. This iron is worse than a pile of beast dung. She felt chewed up, spit out, and stepped on. "Let me help you with your scarf," Solomon said, coming up beside her. "Your face looks a little red." "Afraid a sunburn will affect my value on the open market?" He laughed. "Something like that." She paused long enough for him to move the scarf to her head and quickly fashioned an elaborate wrap that both kept the sun out of her eyes and covered the lower half of her face. "This should keep some of the sand out of your mouth." "Thanks," she said gruffly, then turned her attention to the horizon and resumed walking. They were in a loose group, walking dune to dune in the heat of the realm's merciless suns. "So, how does a Fae end up with no wings?" Solomon asked, taking place by her side. "Are you one of a kind?" Gilly considered not responding in solidarity with Phaedra, who had held her tongue since the night before, ignoring any questions from their captors. She admired the Fae's backbone, but Solomon had a way of drawing her into conversation. The look on his face now was inquisitive, but with a hint of amusement. "Afraid not," she admitted. "Where I'm from, none of the Fae have wings. In fact, I was startled to see the pair on Phaedra." The other Fae looked back over her shoulder from where she was walking with Holly ahead of her. She winked, then turned her attention back to the sand surrounding them. "A whole realm of wingless Fae," Solomon ruminated. "Are there other differences between your varieties?" Gilly cocked an eyebrow at him. "Since the first time I met winged Fae was in the auction tent, I can't say we've had much time to compare anatomies." There was a strangled noise from ahead, and she could see Phaedra's shoulders shaking from repressed laughter. Solomon's lips were twitching as well. "That's a shame. But it could give one the idea to undertake the study themselves. You might not want to mention the idea around the prince." Gilly scowled at the reminder of her future owner. "Just when I relax my guard around him, he gives me a reason not to." "Aren't we going to stop for lunch soon?" Solomon shook his head. "We eat on our feet." Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a piece of fruit and tossed it to her. "Try this. It's just as sweet as you are." Gilly bit into the unfamiliar fruit, and it filled her mouth with an intense sour juice. Her face puckered up, and she scowled in Solomon's direction, but he was already walking away from her. Swallowing the juice, she continued to eat, figuring it best to fortify herself for the journey. And more ways than one, she thought, her eyes burning into her captor's back. The landscape continued to befuddle Gilly, her eyes having glazed over hours ago at the lack of variety in her surroundings. She continued trudging forward, longing for her former strength. Pulling at the iron collar around her neck, she tried to unlock it once again, as she had any time she had a free hand and a free moment, but her fingers could find no purchase. "We've nearly reached our first stop," Solomon said from the head of the line. His long shadow stretched across the sand in the fading light. "Acutics is only a few miles off. There is an inn there where we'll be spending the night." "I'm surprised a realm like this even has an inn," Gilly grumbled, drawing a laugh from her captor. "The finest inn in all of the 17 hells," he replied with a grin. "Certainly it will be up to your undoubtedly high standards, Mujisa." She tilted her head, repeating the word he'd called her over and over in her head. Something held her back from asking him what it meant. Gilly was stubborn, and that meant she wanted nothing from him, even a nickname. Wait, what did he say about the hells? "This is one of the hell realms?" she asked quietly. She wasn't anxious to have Phaedra's suspicion confirmed, but she needed every drip of information she could get to pass on to Lena. "Indeed it is." With a sweep of his arm across the vista before them, Solomon announced their location. "You have the privilege of visiting Ahriman Abad, home of Ahriman Arshan, and one of the 5 princes of darkness." A sudden burst of wind blew across the sands, and Gilly squinted her eyes, grateful for the scarf to block out the worst of it. The desert winds were erratic. She'd learned on their trek, rising up out of nowhere and disappearing just as quickly. Except this time, the wind didn't die down. It built until her clothing flapped around her. The intensity of the wind made a high keening sound that reminded Gilly of the wails of a loon. It was as if their conversation had summoned it, as if to prove that the landscape was as horrible as one would expect. She ducked her head, trying to keep the sand from flowing into her scarf. That was when she noticed that the sands were starting to stir around her, picked up by the ferocity of the gale. "Sandstorm!" This was from the taller of the two raiders who Solomon had chosen to help him escort his merchandise. Gilly's eyes shot to Solomon, and her heart stuttered when she saw the grim expression on his face. Then she could barely see her hand in front of her face as the sand surrounded them. "Go!" Phaedra yelled, grabbing her arm and rushing off into the sands. Holly clung to the Fae's other arm, lifting her slim legs high as they struggled through the shifting dunes beneath their feet. Visibility had nearly vanished, and they had no idea in which direction they were going, but Gilly put all her remaining energy reserves into running with all she had. The storm might present the best opportunity they had to evade their captors, and they couldn't waste it. Without warning, she was suddenly plucked from the ground by something she couldn't see, something that was rapidly carrying her away from her friends, who continued to flee across the sands. In seconds, she could no longer see them. "Stop!" she screamed, her mouth filling with sand. She coughed, clearing her mouth, then beat her fist across the broad back of the one who held her. "Knock it off!" Solomon shouted. "I can survive a storm such as this easily, but your delicate little form can't." "Let me try. It might be worth it to escape your clutches," she cried, aiming a kick at his shin. It landed, but he ignored it, like he might a mosquito bite. No matter how she wailed on him, he showed no reaction. Minutes later, with the howl of the wind near deafening, he ducked inside a cave and carried her deep inside, finally releasing her to land in a heap on the stone floor. Gilly clambered back to her feet immediately, retracing their steps. "You can't leave the others out there." "I'm not," Solomon growled, grabbing her arm and holding her back. "My men are with them. They'll get them to safety." "You can't be sure of it." "You're right," he said, his tone softening. "But there is one thing I know for certain. If you leave this cave, the sand will strip the skin off your bones and flay you alive before you reach your companions." Her eyes watched the cave entrance, but she could see nothing but a wall of sand beyond it. The strength went out of her, and she nearly collapsed. Solomon put his arm around her to keep her from falling, retreating deeper into the cave. It was dark there, too dark to see more than the outline of her captor. On instinct, Gilly tried to access her magic to cast a light spell, but the collar prevented her, making her feel more defeated than before. Then Solomon snapped his fingers, and the cave burst into light, compliments of a dozen balls of flame that had arrayed themselves near the ceiling. The light flickered around the cave, bouncing off the walls and the jagged rock formation that protruded from the ceiling and floor, reminding her of teeth. "We'll wait out the storm here. It could be my men find us, but if they have any sense, they've already tucked themselves away in a cave of their own." "How did you find this place?" she asked, pulling herself away from his grip and ignoring the heat his touch had left on her arm. "I couldn't see a leafing thing out there." "A system of caves runs underneath the desert for hundreds of miles," he revealed, finding a smooth patch of floor to settle himself on, knees bent and legs crossed. "There are many entrances, if you know where to find them. We did not become the most successful raiders in Ahriman-Abad without memorizing the entire network." "Do they all connect?" she asked, a plan unfurling itself in her mind. Why trudge across the surface under the blistering heat of 2 suns if you could walk in the shade? "Sadly, no," Solomon replied, his tone sounding as if he had read her thoughts. "An underground highway sounds ideal, but there are other things that lurk in these caverns, things even more deadly than a sandstorm." "Then why risk coming here?" Gilly asked, pacing nervously. "If some monster is going to leap out and—" His chuckle cut her off. Don't worry, Mujisa, he said with a broad smile. I will keep you safe. She turned her back on him with a scowl, staring once again toward the cave entrance in the distance. Gilly heard him moving behind her and snuck a glance over her shoulder to find Solomon having stretched out to lie down. How can you sleep at a time like this? She grumbled angrily. Because on a hell world, one learns to rest when the opportunity presents itself. When the land around you and the beasts upon it are doing their best to kill you, any quiet moment should be used to recharge one's energy. She knew his words made sense, but she was too on edge. Running her hands up and down her arms, she shivered, the heat of the day having given way to a much colder night inside the cavern. Gilly stiffened when she heard him call to her. I can help you warm, Mujisa. She turned to see him sit up to remove his vest and drape it on the stone beside him. Solomon patted the floor, his smile starting to slip, then she didn't come as beckoned. I offer you only warmth, Fae, nothing more, and I do not take what isn't freely given. Gilly read his subtext and knew he was talking about taking liberties. Except what you took from the raiders? She heard him sigh, then shivered again, her eyes feeling heavy. The thought of huddling for warmth against the cave wall alone was less appealing than signing up to brush the teeth of a beast. Giving in, she sat down on the vest, moving as close to him as she could without actually touching him. If you lay a finger on me, I'll break it, she told him with as much menace as she could, ignoring the burst of air that told her he'd silently laughed at her. Gilly was stiff as a tree trunk, already resenting the situation. Then she felt the heat radiating from him and accepted that she'd made the right choice. Her eyes fell shut of their own accord. Gilly blinked at the sound of footsteps with bleary eyes. Am I interrupting something? Said a familiar voice. She scrambled as fast as she could away from the slaver and to her feet. It's for heat only, she told her sister, who was wearing a tickled expression. Sure, Lena replied, waving her hands as a giggle slipped out. I'm not judging. Gilly caught her breath. I hadn't even realized I'd fallen asleep. She looked back at where Solomon was sleeping soundly with a smile on his handsome face. And apparently I'm dreaming about sleeping in my slave's arms. Great. Please tell me you know where you are, Lena rushed to say. I'm worried that I may not always be able to find you. Your dreams aren't always where they should be. Gilly sighed heavily. I've been too tired to dream, but I do have good news for you. Your dear sister is currently sleeping in a cave while a sandstorm roars outside in the beautiful and scenic desert masterpiece that is Ahriman Abad, one of the 17 realms of the adversary. Her sister gasped, her purple eyes going wide. You're on a hell world. How did this happen? Oh, I don't know, Gilly said with an exaggerated gesture. Maybe because a demon kidnapped me and brought me to a world where they sell Fae to a prince of darkness to add to his collection. Right, Lena said with a sheepish nod. Sorry, it's just, wow, one of the 17 hells. She let out a long breath. Okay, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to find out where this particular hell is located in the web and prepare the troops for a rescue mission. Her sister put her hands on Gilly's shoulders, her tone confident. You're going to keep whatever this is going. She pointed to the sleeping Solomon and back to Gilly. You need a protector to keep you safe, and the fact that he is a swarthy warrior can only work to your advantage. Keep him happy. Keep him close. You're talking about the man who's enslaved me and plans to sell me off for untold riches, sister, Gilly said, disentangling herself from Lena's grip. I'm going to get myself as far away from him as I can at the first opportunity. Might not be a good idea, Lena countered. If he wants to sell you, then he'll keep you safe until you reach his intended buyer. and by then, I'll have arrived with the rescue squad." "Lena, you don't under—" Her words cut off when she woke suddenly. Gilly rolled over with a groan, disoriented and feeling just as tired as before falling asleep. Then she realized that the space next to her was empty. "I'm alone." Chapter 10. It only took a glance for her to find that she hadn't been abandoned. Solomon's form was a shadow in front of the mouth of the cave where the sun was once again shining. Sitting up, Gilly rubbed the sleep out of her eyes. Her movement attracted her jailer's attention. He turned, walking back to where she sat. She was taken aback by the coolness of his expression. "Get up! We've got to go looking for the others." "Good morning to you too," she said testily, pulling herself to her feet. "I'm not sure how you expect to find them after that storm. There will be no tracks, and everything looks like everything else." "Only to an off-worlder with the most intriguing lavender eyes," he said, the chill surrounding him starting to melt. "You're looking at an expert. Now, less moving your mouth and more moving your feet." Solomon led her back out of the cave, wanting her to keep her eyes on her steps. "Sand can be shoved into strange formations during a storm. There are hollows that can form or slides that can knock you down and bury you before you blink." Gilly kept close to him, stepping where he did. A few minutes after setting out, Solomon pointed to the entrance to another cave. It was the same color of the sands and half buried, and she never would have seen it if he hadn't shown her. Solomon picked up his pace, skirting around the pile of sand in the entrance to disappear inside. Gilly was hot on his heels, not wanting to be left alone among the dunes. She was also eager to find her friends, or I guess I could say the opposite. She found herself hoping against hope that they'd managed to get away during the storm, finding safety somewhere out of the harsh elements. The first cave held nothing but the skeleton of a lizard that would have been the size of a male fae if it wasn't a collection of bones on a bed of sand. A thorough search turned up nothing, and they headed back out into the dunes on the hunt for the next cave entrance, and then the next after that. Gilly blinked her eyes in the dimness of the fourth empty cave. What little conversation they'd managed had stalled, and Gilly's confidence in Solomon's theory was waning. "Maybe they made it to the city he mentioned," she told herself when she could summon a scrap of hope. But that hope was in short supply. A supply that came up empty when they followed the curve of the cavern around to discover two dead bodies propped against the cave wall. Solomon let out a yell of frustration. Gilly crouched beside the lifeless corpses of the raiders, looking for clues to their demise, but she could see no tears in their clothing or marks on their skin. "What happened?" "Someone came along and snatched up my merchandise is what happened," he growled, then started grabbing at the pockets of his men. "Their packs are missing," he said, straightening, "and their pockets are empty." "Where are Phaedra and Holly?" Fear gripped her heart as she swiveled around and began searching the rest of the cave. She didn't get far before she hit a dead end, then circled back to find Solomon with his hands pressed to the foreheads of the deceased raiders. She heard him speaking in a foreign language, then lowering his head. A flash of red light illuminated their faces, and in a flash they disintegrated, their ashes blending with the sands that littered the floor of the cave. Gilly took a few steps back from the man, surprised at the power he'd just displayed. Although she'd known he was a formidable leader from the deference his men showed him, she wasn't aware of the depth of his magical abilities. Casting a light spell is one thing, but vaporizing bodies, that's another thing entirely. "We need to hunt the ones who took them," he said, his eyes glowing red for a moment so short she thought she might have hallucinated it. "They will regret crossing me." "The raider has been raided," Gilly said, unable to hold back a little glee. Although she feared for her friends, if he was correct in his assumption, she also had hope that maybe the women had escaped on their own. Just because these two were left for dead doesn't mean they had their women with them at the time of their demise. Something could have come upon them alone and dealt the death blows while Phaedra and Holly were safe somewhere else. "Let's go," Solomon said, jerking his head in the direction of the exit. "We don't have much time if we're going to catch their abductors." "You're the abductor?" Gilly shouted. the absurdity of the situation making her lose control of her temper. "You stole us from the auction, and whoever kidnapped us with the intent to sell us into a life of slavery in the first place. It's ridiculous that you're angry that someone is doing to you what you did to the auctioneer." "There are far worse things that could have happened to you after that auction," he said, his tone sinister. "Owners who wouldn't hesitate to strike you down for your mouth." She stepped forward and glared up at him, anger radiating from the lines of her body. "You want to strike me? Go ahead. It will only show how insecure you really are. But if you want to face me like a man, then remove this collar from my neck and make it a fair fight." Solomon looked at her, one of his eyebrows slowly rising. A half smile appeared, and he leaned closer, his voice husky. "I wish we had more time to play, Mujisa, but I have inventory to recover." He turned his back on her, heading toward the exit without a backward glance. Gilly stood there for a moment, getting a hold on her temper. She knew he wouldn't leave her behind. His little stunt was meant to show her that she needed his protection, despite the fact that he was only interested in selling her. She followed after a short delay and made her way out of the cave. The sandstorm had exposed a low ridge of rock that lay hidden beneath the dunes, meaning that the cave's mouth had been easier to find. She left it now, her eyes on Solomon, who was several yards away and moving toward another range of dunes in the distance. Gilly sighed, already tired of walking in the heat, and set off after him. She'd only gone a few paces when something whooshed past her, heading in the direction of the Dev. He heard it soon enough to turn around and not to avert the fireball that burst against his chest, sending him skidding across the sands. Gilly spun around in the direction from which the spell had come, eyes widening when she saw two feminine forms standing atop the ridge. "Come on," Phaedra called to her, beckoning. Then she aimed another fireball at the slaver. This one he managed to bat away, having regained his feet. He was headed in Gilly's direction. She didn't hesitate. Gilly sprinted toward the rock face, launching herself at the ridge with arms outstretched. The Fae caught her and pulled her up with strength and ease. She noticed that Phaedra had one of the raiders' packs tied around her waist. Holly was wearing the other on her back. "Get over the ridge and keep running," Phaedra instructed, her fingertips starting to glow. Gilly watched her create a sphere of energy between her hands, then channel it to aim a spear of lightning at the Dev's chest. She heard Solomon cry out in pain, then was yanked backward by Holly. "What happened in that cave?" she asked the human, who shook her head and kept going, clambering over the rock to try and reach the dune on the far side of it. "The sandstorm somehow damaged the ring around her ankle, and it cracked open. Phaedra and I tried to sneak past the raiders, but I stumbled, and they heard me fall. Then Phaedra—" Holly looked away, a lost expression on her face. "She thought we should wait to see if you would show up before we hightailed it to the city." Hearing Phaedra shriek behind her, Gilly turned back, watching while the Fae summoned a storm of ice blades that rained down from above. She turned to give Gilly a wide smile of triumph, then a bellow from below made her smile slip. "Run!" she called, barreling toward her up the ridge. Gilly gasped when she saw a pair of oversized hands gripping the ledge of the ridge where Phaedra had been standing moments ago. A pair of horns appeared next, and a sinking feeling consumed Gilly's stomach. A few seconds later, she was staring at the 9-foot monstrosity that had led the charge at the auction. She felt numb, but her brain was still able to process this new development. There is no monster pet, she realized. Solomon is this creature. His dark eyes met hers, and he unleashed a snarl, breaking the moment. Gilly scrambled up the final stretch of rock and joined Holly on the sand that was already shifting under her feet. "Go!" Phaedra said, motioning frantically. "I'll try and hold him off here. Holly, give Gilly the ring." The two of them took unsteady steps down the dune while Phaedra blasted the monstrous Solomon over and over again. Holly grabbed her hand, and Gilly realized she was passing something to her. She opened her hand to find a small silver ring sitting in her palm. "Phaedra found some silver in the raider's pockets, and she used it to form 3 rings. I have one," she said, lifting up her index finger to show her the ring around her own finger. "Don't lose that." "What is it for?" Gilly asked in confusion, the events they'd faced since leaving Solomon's hideout having blanked her mind. "Remember the legend?" Holly prompted. "Put a ring of silver on a Dev and call their name, and you have the means to control them."
Phaedra said that was just a myth.
Nevertheless, she carefully tucked the silver away inside the pocket of her pants.
I thought vampires were myth too, Holly said, her eyes round with fright. It's our best chance to get him off our backs so we can find a way out of this place.
Gilly nodded, then stretched out her hand to put it on Holly's shoulder to bolster her, but the motion unsteadied her, and she slipped, unable to get purchase on the shifting sands. She dropped, Holly falling with her, and the two of them rolled down the dune to land at the bottom in a heap. Groaning, Gilly pulled herself up, her eyes shooting to the top of the dune where Solomon was advancing on Phaedra. He hadn't drawn the hammer on his back, she saw, and did some quick thinking. He still considers her his merchandise and is trying not to scratch it? The monstrous Solomon let out a roar that blew back Phaedra's hair. She glanced in their direction to find them looking up at her from the bottom of the dune. Leaping into the air, her wings unfurled, and she soared in their direction. She was just landing beside them when Solomon let out another howl and jumped into the air, arcing over to land a few feet away unharmed. How are we going to manage to get a tiny ring on that finger? She wondered, then set off running after Phaedra and Holly, who were headed for a line of scrub grass poking through the sand in front of them. She could feel his footsteps shaking the ground under her feet, making it difficult not to stumble. Solomon gained on her in seconds, his lengthened stride making it easy to catch up. His massive hand grabbed her shoulder, stopping her cold, and Gilly cried out to her companions. Phaedra turned and froze, and Gilly saw hints of exhaustion on her face. The fight against the monster was taking it out of her, and Gilly knew she couldn't hold out forever. Phaedra took a deep breath, then started back in her direction, her fingers once again crackling with energy. Gilly struggled in Solomon's grip, but his hand was like a vice, and there was no way she could wriggle out. When Phaedra got within a yard of them, Monster Solomon let out a fierce growl that had Gilly trembling. "She's mine," he warned, his enormous chest heaving. "You will not take her from me!" Phaedra eyed him, then wiggled the fingers on her right hand. Gilly saw the ring blinking there and gave the Fae a small nod. She could see the anguish in the other woman's eyes. She can't blast him without risking hurting me, but she doesn't want to leave me behind. Another roar came from the beast's mouth, his exposed tusk gleaming. He took a step forward, then another, and Phaedra was forced to retreat. "I'm running out of energy," a tired voice said in her head. "Go," Gilly replied. "Get the human to safety. Someone needs to make it to freedom." She saw Phaedra lower her head slowly, then heard her response. "I will find reinforcements and come back for you." Gilly nodded. "Find my mother, Elspeth, Fae Queen, at least in our realm," she added. "I've cut the ring and will do as you suggest." Solomon lunged forward suddenly, coming within a foot of the Fae. Phaedra grabbed Holly's arms and leapt into the air, her wings beating. Gilly watched as they flew into the distance, a pair of shadows against the wide blue sky. Chapter 11. Gilly picked at the hole in the sleeve of her shirt and clicked her tongue in disappointment. It seemed a foolish thing to waste her attention on in a situation like the one she was currently facing, but it was better than focusing on what was happening a few yards away. The monster version of Solomon had tossed her over its shoulder after Phaedra and Holly's daring escape, and Gilly soon lost track of how long they'd been traveling. She was surprised when the creature carried her into another cave. He sent her down with gentleness, taking her aback. He grunted, then pointed in the direction of an opening in the cave wall. Gilly walked through the crack and into another chamber where a small waterfall tumbled down the cave wall and into a small pool. Solomon followed her in, picking her up and setting her down again on a flat rock beside the pool. Then he disappeared back through the opening, leaving her alone. She could hear him outside, growling and scratching his claws against the stone walls of the cave. Gilly wondered how long he'd remained in this form, and whether he'd return to the Solomon she knew. If I have to spend the rest of my journey with this guy, I might decide to just bury myself in the sand. Gilly tucked a hand into her pocket for the 100th time to make sure the ring was still where she'd placed it. She knew Phaedra's plan was a long shot, but it was the only plan they had for now, at least until Lena appeared with her band of rescuers. "How am I going to get this thing on his finger?" she mused. No situation she could envision ended with her succeeding in that quest. "He's too quick and I'm too slow, thanks to this stupid thing." She fiddled with the collar once again, desperate to get it off. To have seen Phaedra with her powers in full force left Gilly with a desperate need to restore her own magic. It's the best chance I have of turning the tables on that creature. But her fingers could find no purchase, and she released the collar once again. A truth came to her then, one that unsettled her stomach. I bet he could get it off me. But how can I convince him? A gruff voice came from the opening. You shouldn't have run from me. Gilly looked up, relieved to see the more manageably sized Solomon. I've always been of the opinion that it's Fae before foes, she said lightly, then turned her back on him again. The spot was pleasant, one of the nicest ones she'd seen in the realm, and she was in no hurry to return to the dune and her incessant fight with her captor. Water, he said, shoving a skin her direction. Finish it off, and we'll refill it before we go. Gilly did as he said, the cool water running down her throat, soothing some of the burning inside her. I don't suppose you have any food to go with this? She asked, wondering how the monster inside him managed to live on the fruit and dried meat that Dev had packed for the journey. He reached inside his pack to pull out a small portion of dried fruit, soft cheese, some flat bread, and a small pot of pickled vegetables. Gilly arrayed them on the rock beside her and dug in. She watched as Solomon bent to the pool and dipped his water skin in. Bubbles rose as he filled it, and Gilly wondered how he could be so calm now, when moments ago he'd been throwing a monstrous fit. What chance have I got to convince him to take off the collar? He's well aware of its effects, and there's no way he'll risk losing me, and his big payday by extension. She picked at the food he'd offered, thinking about what her sister Lena had said. Keep him happy. Keep him close. Gilly didn't have much to say about the closeness, but the happiness. I suppose I could be less annoying, but I'm not sure that will get me far. She picked up a piece of fruit and toyed with it, absently placing it between her lips and sucking it to consume any lingering sweetness. Her eyes flicked up, and she caught Solomon staring at her lips. He looked away when he realized her gaze was on him. Straightening, he returned with the water skin and placed it on the rock beside the spread. Then he went into a crouch and helped himself to a piece of flatbread, folding it and tucking some cheese inside. He chewed, staring off into the distance, avoiding her eyes. I could seduce him. The thought came out of nowhere, and Gilly immediately pushed it away, calling herself 10 types of idiot. Seduce Solomon, the hammer of the desert with a rage-filled behemoth hidden inside him? I could just as easily sprout wings and fly away. Still, the idea lingered, and she started to take it more seriously. She'd seen men become fools over females before. Just look at Bracken. He risked his commission, banishment, and outright death for treason, all to help my sister Lena recover her memories and reunite the entire Fae Realm. But Bracken was a Fae. He was a city dweller, one who followed different customs than the wildlings she belonged to, but they still shared a basic culture and history. Solomon, however, was a different story altogether. Phaedra said that Dev were natural enemies to our kind. He may find the very idea of a romantic connection with me repulsive. The look in his eyes when he was staring at you definitely was not repulsion, her inner voice replied. It's worth a try, since you've got nothing else going for you at the moment. But how to seduce the Dev? Gilly had zero experience in using her feminine wiles. Her position as second in command of the wilding Fae tended to intimidate potential romantic partners. Not to mention it kept her too busy to consider any of her more tender emotions. She would be reliant on her observations of courtship, few as they were, and how she'd seen her sister act around the soldier who'd captured her heart. I've never had cheese like this, she ventured in an even voice. It's very smooth and flavorful. Solomon turned his head in her direction and nodded. My housekeeper makes it herself. She may be the best cook in the realm, but don't tell the Prince of Darkness when you meet him. Gilly turned on a high-wattage smile and laughed at his joke. Keeping secrets, are you? What else shouldn't I tell the big guy when I meet him? Solomon looked at her, traces of confusion at her change in demeanor visible in his expression. Eramon knows virtually everything about his realm, and those of us who inhabit it, although he leaves matters to themselves mostly. Which is why he isn't cracking down on the blatant raider who has hit the same auctioneer multiple times. The grin remained in place, but her tone was teasing, not accusatory. Right, Solomon said with a chuckle. the tension in his body relaxing. "He's got bigger issues to worry about. Shaitan keeps his princes busy."
"And I thought being a friend of the devil meant a life of leisure." Gilly waggled her eyebrows at him, and Solomon laughed again.
"What would a creature of light know about a life lived in darkness?" he asked. "Fae are known for their beauty and brightness." Gilly recognized an opportunity and grabbed at it greedily.
"You think I'm beautiful?"
She widened her eyes and fluttered her lashes, then leaned in and slowly trailed a hand from her neck over her collar and down to her neckline.
"Truly?"
Solomon opened his mouth to speak, his eyes filled with something that vanished a moment later. He straightened, putting his hands on his thighs and giving her a patronizing expression. "You are more innocent than I thought," he said with a chuckle. "For your information, I've been seduced by women far more skilled than you. The little gambit you're employing will get you nowhere."
"A gambit?"
She blinked, gambling on continuing the deception.
"What do you mean?"
"You're as see-through as a ghost. Whatever you hope to gain by flirting with me, I can guarantee you're wasting your time."
"I'm not flirting," she said,
stiffening. It was evident that she needed to lay off, at least for now, because he'd cottoned on to her plan. "I know flirting when I see it," he countered, "but I wonder if you know how to do it. It's apparent you've never seduced someone before."
"You're being ridiculous,"
she said with a sniff, flipping her scarf over her shoulder. "Am I?" He leaned over closer, folding his hands between his knees. "Tell me then, who has my Mujisa seduced?"
"I'm not your anything,"
she said, her voice rising. Her temper had gotten the better of her, putting her plan in jeopardy, but the way he was poking at her annoyed Gilly.
"You know nothing about my personal life, and that's not going to change."
His smile widened, and he leaned in farther. Without saying a word, he picked up a piece of dried fruit and raised it to his lips, his expression playful. He repeated her previous action, running the fruit along his bottom lip. He popped it into his mouth and chewed, heat entering his eyes as he stared at her. "Might as well take the opportunity for a bath when it presents itself," he said, standing. Gilly's eyes followed his movements, her cheeks heating. She watched as he began to remove his clothing, then averted her gaze when, shirtless, he began to undo his belt.
"I thought there was danger in these caves,"
Gilly said, her voice shaky. His nearly nude form this close was putting her on edge. Desire bloomed inside her, and she snuck another glance. She'd never seen a more finely made male, muscular and strong, with smooth bronze skin and thick dark hair. Her pitch turned high and reedy when she spoke again.
"Are you sure it's smart to climb into that pool? What if some species of toothy fish lives there?"
Solomon let out a soft chuckle. "Worried I might be attacked? And here I thought you didn't care about me." Gilly let out a huff of air, then turned away when his pants dropped. Moments later, she heard a splash. She busied herself putting away their food, trying to ignore the fact that her naked Solomon was splashing around mere feet from her. "It seems I've forgotten my soap," he called to her. "There is a bar in my pack, wrapped in a towel." She stood to retrieve his pack and his towel, then tossed it to him quickly to avoid looking in his direction for long. He laughed and started to hum. Gilly heard a few splashes, then quiet. The desire to look grew every second the silence stretched on. "Why don't you join me?" he asked lazily, breaking the quiet. "The water is very pleasant, and you never know when you'll get another chance at a bath in this realm."
"No, thank you," she said, her voice coming out half-strangled. "I'll take my chances."
She was staring at the far wall, telling herself that she was being foolish. No man should have this effect on a woman, especially a man whose plan was selling her into a life of slavery. Despite what her mind thought, her body had a different opinion. She heard him pull himself from the water and couldn't stop herself from stealing a glance. His powerful body, dripping with water, sleek and healthy, filled her with a lust the likes of which she'd never experienced. "You should have joined me," his soft voice said behind her shoulder, and she stiffened. His naked form is only inches from me. Her heart was pounding in her chest, drowning out the noises he made as he dressed. "You can turn around now," he said gently, but when she did, she found him close to her once again. Only inches from his broad chest, she looked up into his face, powerless to entirely hide the effect he had on her. Solomon leaned in until their faces were only inches apart. Gilly licked her lips in anticipation, knowing that if he kissed her in this moment, she wouldn't stop him. No, I'd kiss him back for all I'm worth. And that, he said softly, the corners of his mouth turning up, is how you seduce someone, Mujisa. Gilly shoved him, the anger boiling up inside her so quickly she didn't even think. Her actions did nothing to the wall of muscle except make Solomon laugh. Let's go, Fae. We've got ground to cover if we're going to reach the city before sundown. He picked up his pack and left the chamber. Gilly, embarrassment stinging her insides, followed behind, swearing to leave her revenge on the dev for his trick. Her anger was the only thing keeping the humiliation at bay. Chapter 12. Still burning with anger, Gilly grumbled to herself while cresting the last dune. Below them lay the fortified city of Acutix. She eyed the high walls, the tops of which were embedded with jagged pieces of broken glass, encircling a city that was a fraction of the size of Ixaria, capital of the Fae Realm. The buildings were squat and close together, and like the rest of the structures in the Hell World, they were the same light brown color of the sand comprising the dunes they'd trekked across. Come, Solomon said, gesturing for her to follow. He set off down the dune, his large stride making it seem easy. She considered ignoring his command, but Gilly knew it would be a gesture of futility. She went after him, fighting not to lose her balance in the shifting sands. The ground hardened after they left the dunes behind. Gilly's legs felt weirdly shaky on flat land, as if she'd forgotten how to walk on anything but sand. Approaching the tall metal gates, she kept close to her captor, not liking the looks of the guards who were watching over those coming and going. Don't speak, even when spoken to. Acutix is the only fortified city in the realm, and it stays that way by remaining on guard for any whiff of treachery. Solomon's expression was blank, but she could see the seriousness in his eyes. Why, is this the